And religion is supposed to be a social text, like a rule book of best practices to follow. And therefore, it's going to say things like, don't murder people, don't steal from people. You know, that's kind of the whole game, right? Therefore, you're automatically disqualifying if you are engaging in some kind of nation state project that requires the extermination of people that were living there before you implemented this settler colonial operation. Overzealots released a new video about what you're talking about. How to destroy every Zionist talking point from Overzealots 2 hours ago. What a fantastic video to start with.
To you by Ground News. Disclaimer. This video deals with sensitive and contentious topics, one of which is race. Scientific consensus affirms that race is a social construct with no real biological basis. The usage of the term race throughout this video has nothing to do with biology or science in any meaningful sense. Race is a human invention created to impose arbitrary hierarchical distinctions between people. Distinctions with very real consequences. And as this video progresses, we will see how many different supremacist ideologies, from Zionism to Nazism, flirt with such a construction to serve their specific goals. Plenty of nationalist projects rely on grand nation-building narratives and myths, and when it comes to the state of Israel,
shouts out to Overzealots for this video, debunking every Zionist talking point, destroying every Zionist talking point. We're going to go through. This is a long video, but I think it's a very good one. I'm going to go pee real quick.
Those narratives are abundant. Israel derives much of its sense of legitimacy from ahistorical fables, some informed by religious texts, others crafted as post hoc justifications for the fascistic aspirations of the Zionist project. Ultimately, these nation-building narratives serve to oppress and subjugate the Palestinian people while offering a veneer of legitimacy to the settler colonial state of Israel. This video is meant to be a kind of guide for dealing with Israeli propaganda. I'll go over every major Zionist talking point and offer a rebuttal. I recommend watching it all the way through the first time and then using the timestamps in the description if you ever want to revisit specific sections. This will be part 1 of a 2-part series. In this episode, I'll be tackling the historical narrative surrounding the state of Israel, its formation, the biblical and ancient myths it leans on, and more. The next episode will focus on more contemporary Zionist propaganda. It's important when dealing with this topic, or any topic for that matter, we not only take into account the mainstream narrative that's constantly shoved in our faces, but we do the proper research and try to understand the entire picture. Challenging our blind spots is how we arrive at a genuine understanding, and the sponsor of today's video can help with that. I use Ground News to get a feel for how a story is being covered across the political spectrum, which outlets are in the forefront, and which ones choose to engage in omission. For example, if we take a look at this article titled, Amnesty International says Israel and aid system use starvation to commit Gaza genocide. The majority of the coverage is by left-leaning media outlets, with only a few right-wing outlets picking up the story. Ground News's bias comparison tool is another feature I find helpful. With just a click of a button, we can get an overview and learn that left-leaning outlets frame Israel's actions as a deliberate genocidal campaign, while right-leaning outlets emphasize Israel's rebuttals and undermine claims of Israeli intent. This can be further illustrated by comparing the way the headlines are written in the leftmost outlets with the way they're written in the center or the rightmost outlets. The Intercept, the furthest left outlet to present this story, used more accusatory and charged language than its center or right-wing counterpart. Ground News also makes it easy to see who owns and funds the publications in question, as well as their factuality. So subscribe to get 40% off the Unlimited Vantage plan by using my link, groundnews.com/over, or by clicking the link below. Now let's get back to the video. Land for a people without land. This talking point is fairly straightforward. The idea is that Jews had nowhere to go, and the land of Palestine was nothing more than a barren desert waiting for their arrival.
When many Jewish people returned...
It's funny because, like, I feel like he's just condensing 10 myths into a 1 hour and 31-minute video and expanding on it as well. This is why it's like a fairly solid starting point. 10 myths by Elon Pape is a really good starting point to this conversation for a lot of people.
To the promised land in the 1800s, the land was dry and barren. But
Oh, it's
just
a
like the
two-parter.
Bible
Makes
says,
sense.
Israelis have found unique ways to make the desert bloom and prosper.
In actuality, Palestine had a thriving society well before the arrival of Zionist settlers. A notable region was that of Jabal Nablus during the 18th and 19th century Ottoman rule. Nablus, the legendary city within the region of Jabal Nablus, was more than just some important interior city, but it was the heart for regional trade and local manufacturing. It was the most important of the interior cities in terms of continuous settlement, density of population, economic activity, leadership role, and degree of autonomy within Ottoman rule, wrote Palestinian-American academic Bishara Doumani. He goes on to point out how features usually associated with so-called modernization, such as commercial agriculture, a money economy in the rural...
The Boers say this about the Cape too. Yes, and white supremacists still say this about Zimbabwe. They say, oh, Rhodesia had technological proficiency, but then when it fell to the hands of dangerous Africans, which is, you know, the indigenous population, of course, you know, they claim that the real problem was not the real problem was not necessarily the. See, this is what I mean. Look. Yeah, they still say that about South Africa. They say it about India too. But the real problem is, of course, not like crippling sanctions or a revenge campaign, pretty much, but instead is actually simply because black people are inferior. Like, it's a relitigation of white supremacist propaganda.
Areas, differentiation within the peasantry, commoditization of land, and ties to the world market were present in Jabal Nablus before they were supposedly introduced by the Egyptian occupation, the Ottoman Tanzimat, or Jewish colonization. Palestine even had its own legendary rulers like Zahir al-Umar, as well as its own unique political complexities and strategic alliances. By the 19th century, Palestine was even starting to develop its own nationalism and secularization movements, in which people from all backgrounds could unite in their shared territory, language, and history. But this cultural momentum was unfortunately halted and uprooted by the Zionist movement. Palestinians also had their own unique cultural understanding of and relationship with the land, and notably, the city of Jerusalem. It was more than just a holy site for them, but an administrative center, an education hub, home to important newspapers, clubs, and more. And Jerusalem was far from the sole city of importance in Palestine. Historian Rashid Khalidi points out how the cities of Jaffa and Haifa were beginning to grow rapidly prior to the First World War. Increased trade with Europe, the building of new railways for which these ports were terminals, and the consequent stimulation of economic activity in their immediate hinterland all contributed to their growth and made them commercial centers of the country. So the idea that Palestine was some barren desert devoid of culture or identity until the Zionists arrived and made it bloom is patently false. There was an entire way of life there, from a distinctive Palestinian dialect to customs to rituals and more. As American biblical scholar Miller Burrows wrote in his book Palestine is Our Business, quite untrue is the statement that the majority of Muslims were Bedouins. Actually, most of the Palestinian Arabs, both Muslim and Christian, were farmers living in permanent villages. The rest were craftsmen, shopkeepers, and professional men living in the principal cities. Even in Turkish times, the density of the Arab population in Palestine, aside from the southern desert, was about that of the state of Michigan.
Yeah.
By 1947, it had almost doubled, reaching a figure of nearly 1.3 million.
Pretty sparsely populated, actually, because there wasn't a lot there.
As for the claim that Jews were a landless people who had no choice but to return to...
That's, again, is racist, ahistorical garbage. It is a way to try and justify the initial ethnic cleansing with manifest destiny terminology, which ironically enough is still cruel, but it actually at least like corresponds to American attitudes. But even then it's also wrong. Okay? Like even if Palestinians, the indigenous population there, were like Bedouins, okay, living in tents or whatever, you don't get to kill them. What are we talking about? You don't get to ethnically displace them. Do you see what I mean? That's still completely unacceptable, but it's also completely untrue. So even in the way that they have tried to propagandize this position of ethnic cleansing and ethnic displacement, like it's not only ahistorical, but even the ahistorical attitude is still morally completely unconscionable.
Their conveniently empty and totally uninhabited homeland. This is just the other half of the lie. As Israeli historian Ilan Pappé wrote, Palestine was a land without people goes hand in hand with the Jews were a people without land. Two sides of the same manufactured slogan. A slogan that served more as a marketing tool for Zionism than any kind of historical truth. Pappé even questions whether the early Zionist settlers can be understood as a people at all. He highlights how the very idea of turning Jews into a nation was more so pushed by Christian Zionists. These were Christians, often deeply anti-Semitic, who wanted Jews to quote-unquote return to Palestine in order to fulfill their apocalyptic fantasies about the second coming of the Messiah. But it wasn't just...
Yeah, the greatest trick, the greatest trick here is not like what white supremacists always say is like Jewish trickery. The greatest trick here is to directly lay the blame of Israel in the hands of Jews in general, okay? And this is, of course, in especially contemporary American history, unfortunately not helped by many Zionist Jews who play a formative role in spearheading this effort, for sure. But it's literally a formative part of Christian evangelical Zionism. This is why I always say is like people, so many white nationalists, Christian nationalists, unironically refuse to recognize the incredibly important role Christian Zionism plays in the formation of the Israeli state and the continuation of support for the Israeli state, no matter how violent that project got. It's crazy. A much, much, much larger force in the population.
Theology. Some also believed that supporting Jewish colonization in Palestine would produce reliable geopolitical allies in the region. For them, it was a win-win. They got to offload Jewish communities from their own countries and gain influence in the Middle East. Zionism, as we can see, was therefore a Christian project of colonization before it became a Jewish one, Pappé writes. Whether they came from the US, Britain, or Germany, these Christian supporters of Zionism pushed the return of the Jews long before modern political Zionism even emerged under Theodor Herzl in the late 1800s. So you might be wondering, what does all of this have to do with refuting the idea that Jews were a people without land? The point is this slogan was never a genuine description of reality.
Also, yeah, it's unironically exactly what the Nazis said. Jews are rootless cosmopolitans. They're always outsiders in every community that they're a part of. It is literally adopting the anti-Semitic framing of Jews in general. Okay? And maybe in like in ancient times, okay, maybe in like the medieval era, or maybe all the way up until like pre-World War II, this kind of like ethnic tension or this kind of tribalistic sentiment was somewhat more normal, I guess, even if its impact was unimaginably violent, with exceptions in that time frame, with like the Ottoman Empire being one of those exceptions, right? the irony in modern day, and also like in the growing fascist movements at the time, is that in an effort to implement the Zionist project, this anti-Semitic framework was formative in getting Jews to believe that they were rootless cosmopolitans themselves. This is why I get mad about the Jewish diaspora argument. Okay, this is why it's like a frustrating thing to hear all the time, where it's like, oh, you know, the Jewish diaspora Jews believe in this, diaspora Jews believe in that. It's like, brother, the fuck do you mean? Jews who have had longer roots in New York City than the inception of the nation state of Israel are not diaspora Jews that are just away from the homeland of Israel. The homeland of Israel is a much newer project. This doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of American Jews who also go along with this, because, again, social conditioning is just stupid.
It was a coordinated narrative crafted by both Christian and later Jewish Zionists to justify a settler colonial project. It created a neat, moral-sounding myth to hide a violent reality. In truth, Zionism was a fringe idea among Jews at the time. In making the argument that the Jews were a nation belonging to Palestine and therefore should be helped to return to it, Pape writes, they had to rely on British officials and later, military power. Jews and the world at large did not seem to be convinced that the Jews were a people without land. As Professor Yuri Ram puts it in his essay on Zionist historiography, where he demonstrates how nation-building myths and grand narratives helped shape the Zionist project and remain deeply embedded in the lore of the Israeli state to this day, he writes, the national features imputed to Jewishness by Zionism were not initially taken for granted or widely accepted by Jews in general, and therefore their later almost universal acceptance should be considered as an outcome of invention and persuasion and eventually Nazi persecution, rather than as a natural and inevitable evolution of Jewishness as such. In fact, at the beginning of the 19th century, the secular Jewish cultural elite explicitly rejected the attribution of national significance to their cultural affiliation and considered the nations among whom they lived as their brethren, and the states where they lived as their homelands. Some even suggested that all mention of the return to Zion be removed from the prayer book, and some actually performed this. At the other end of the spectrum, Orthodox Jews also rejected emphatically the attribution of modern national features to Jewish identity, and some later became extreme anti-Zionists. See, the truth is, Jews themselves didn't originally buy into the whole land without a people for a people without a land slogan. Palestine wasn't empty, and Jews had homelands. They lived all over the world, often in relative peace and harmony with their neighbors, notably in the Middle East before the rise of Zionism and colonialism, which sparked nationalist reactions from others in the region. Jews were often even seen as respected pillars in their communities, which we will get deeper into in a later segment. It's also true that Jews have been undeniably wrongfully persecuted and mistreated throughout time, primarily in Europe. But that doesn't give the Zionist movement the right to weaponize and inflict that trauma onto an unrelated group of people, the Palestinians, and subject them to occupation and genocide. Congolese people, Kurdish people, many groups of people have been wrongfully subjected to subjugation and oppression throughout history. The Romani people have been wrongfully persecuted in very similar ways to European Jewry and have sustained massive losses during the Holocaust. I doubt any of us would argue that they too should get a hyper-nationalistic, neo-fascist, ethnocratic state built at the expense of some unrelated group. Zionism is just the belief that Jews should have a place to go. This myth comes in many forms, but the gist is always the same, that Zionism is a harmless movement. You'll hear it framed in different ways, from Zionism just allows for Jewish self-determination in their ancestral homeland, to it gives Jews a place to go.
I think Israel says it's a place where Jews can go.
This narrative can be really tricky to push back on, mostly because a lot of people don't actually have a clear understanding of what Zionism is, and this talking point aims to convince you that it's nothing malevolent. Fundamentally, Zionism is a supremacist, settler colonial, ethno-nationalist, and genocidal ideology in all of its forms. It advocates for a Jewish state along with a legal and military apparatus designed to maintain a Jewish demographic majority in the land of Palestine. By its very nature,
For the Nazis, it was the folk, right? The Ubermensch, the Aryan nation, comprised of whatever the identity was at the time, like the in-group was at the time. And for Zionism, it's Jews. That's it. And the more we allow this dangerous fascist ideology to manifest without actively going against it, okay, the more we allow this ideology to exist in different forms. And of course, there's always going to be marketing, okay? There's always going to be marketing to try and market this kind of sentiment to different subsects of American society from all different backgrounds. Like in the same way that if you want to sell the occupation of Afghanistan, the liberals, you say, well, the Taliban is like anti-women, right? The Taliban is against women. The Taliban is homophobic. If you want to sell it to the Republicans, you say they're primitive and violent, and they want to kill us. They hate us because they ain't us. And every different group has a different thing that they're interested in, but ultimately the goal is still the same. Zionism works in the same exact way, because just like the occupation of Afghanistan, it has like an imperialist root. This is precisely the reason why, for evangelical Christians in the South, Zionism is a theological project that needs to happen so that the rapture can happen. But if you want to talk to a squishy liberal in the in New York, for example, you sell it as like, well, the Arabs are scary, right? Like, think about how scary the Arabs are. Think about how gay Israel is. Israel is so gay. Isn't that awesome? The ultimate goal is still the same. It's a continuation of the exterminationist project, the Jewish supremacist exterminationist project, the expulsion or death and destruction of all non-Jews in the area for the greater Israeli project to exist. That's it. Yeah, I saw the ICJ judge from Uganda or whatever said, not sure exact details, sorry. Yes, she is a evangelical Christian and a absolute sociopath, an absolute freak. She is an evangelical Zionist. She said, I've been placed on this earth by God to defend Israel. That's what she said. And this is not a disqualifying thing, okay? She says she's on a mission from God to defend Israel. One of the judges on the International Court of Justice.
Zionism requires the removal and replacement of the indigenous Palestinian population. This was clearly understood by the early Zionists.
Yeah, she's on a mission from God to bring about the apocalypse. That's a real ass judge, bro.
Settlers. So the idea that it was just a benign movement for Jews who wished to live peacefully alongside Palestinians is false. From the start, Zionists, left and right wing, knew their project would mean displacing the native population, and they did everything they could to achieve that reality. And don't worry, every claim that I'm making right now will be backed up with receipts in the next segment when we talk about the colonial nature of Zionism. Zionists today often claim that they were returning to a rightful homeland, but this too is a myth crafted to justify settler colonial aims. The original Zionists didn't even see Palestine as their only option. It was more or less chosen as a marketing tool. The father of modern political Zionism and Israeli national hero Theodor Herzl, who, by the way, was a secular Jew, as were most of the leading figures of his movement, can be seen in his pamphlet A Jewish State, weighing the pros and cons of a Jewish homeland in either Palestine or Argentina, saying he'd take either one. Shall we choose Palestine or Argentina? Argentina is one of the most fertile countries in the world, extends over a vast area, and has a sparse population and a mild climate. The reason he landed on Palestine was mostly branding and the marketability of the religious connotations Palestine invokes.
A major hurdle for the Zionist project early on was the religious Jews that were like, what the fuck are you saying? Without the Messiah coming back, Jews should not have a land to themselves. Like, there is no national project. It goes against the text. It goes against the rabbinical text. There is no theological justification for building a Jewish nation state. And therefore, in order to get some of the religious Jews, specifically Orthodox Jews, on board, and also get tremendous support from evangelical Christian Zionists, Herzl was like, oh yeah, we'll go to the biblical land of Israel. That's why it's so like Bible focused. Have you guys never thought it was weird? Like, has that never struck you as odd how much of a biblical focus Israel has as a nation state? Like, it's important. Jerusalem is, of course, a profoundly important place for all three of the Abrahamic religions. Okay. But why is this so hammed up? Muslims believe in the text of the Bible more than the Jews do. If we're going to talk just about religion, Islam came after Christianity and therefore abides by the scripture as well, with some exceptions that, like, Jesus Christ was a prophet, but was not literally the direct son of God. Okay. I mean, this isn't even like, why would anybody care about what the Bible says? That's not even what I'm saying. Which is obviously a perfectly reasonable argument as well in this process, and it's utterly irrelevant in the grand scheme of things.
Every name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency, he wrote. Herzl's deliberation between the two radically different countries seriously undermines the narrative that Zionism was always a movement to return Jews to their ancestral homeland in Palestine. Another pernicious aspect.
How do you counter that argument? The Bible? You can't point to religious text to be like, this is why we have to literally ethnically cleanse everyone that lives here. What do you mean? It's the Bible. First of all, there's not a single Christian that actually abides by everything in the Bible. Okay? We're not stoning to death for mixing fabrics. We're not killing people for eating shellfish. Okay? What do you mean? So why is it that we're picking and choosing, and then we're deciding that like the Bible is actually a historically accurate text that must be followed? At no point in the Bible does it say like Israel has to be given back to the Jews anyway. That's like an evangelical interpretation that came after. It's the Bible. It's fiction. What do you mean? Okay, I wrote a book. I wrote a book and I hallucinated something in the book. You have to believe it now. I know some people that justifies Israel's existence based on those texts, like the conversation reaches a dead end. Yeah, but those people also believe in a whole lot of nonsensical bullshit.
Of Zionism is that it transforms members of the Jewish identity into a nation, even a kind of race of people. Jews worldwide, no matter where they're born, are instantly considered part of the nation of Israel and are immediately eligible for Israeli citizenship under the 1950 Law of Return.
Couldn't you say him about the Quran? Yeah. What do you think? I do say the same thing. Religious texts are great if you are personally abiding by it and it gives you comfort, gives you a sense of direction. That's fine. I don't care. Great. But if you use religious scripture, religious texts to justify doing harm to others, then, at that point, it's completely irrelevant. Okay? You can't do that. You can't legislate by way of religion, which is technically against Islam as well, even though throughout the Ottoman Empire, for example, there were plenty of instances where like there was not a perfect continuation of Sharia, just law, right? Religious, Islamic law, because the Quran is the last version of the Abrahamic religions. It's the most updated version, and therefore it has the most amount of practices in it. It even has like laws in it. Sharia, that's what it is, right? But no one has, just like Christians don't follow all of the scriptures, no historic or contemporary Muslim state has ever abided by the full, every single standard of Sharia. Because religion, at the end of the day, is always left up to interpretation. That is not true. Here we go. Taskit Noah.
Meanwhile, Palestinians born in Palestine are excluded and their UN-affirmed right of return is denied. See, when the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from their lands in 1948, the UNGA issued Resolution 194 stating that they, as well as their descendants, ought to be able to...
What is this? Muhammad? What is this? Hasanabi doesn't criticize Islam when it's literally anti-liberalism. Hasanabi is a cop-out. He won't criticize Sharia law when it's anti-liberalism. Did you not hear the words that just came out of my mouth? That no historic Muslim nation, whether the caliphate under the control of the Ottoman Empire or even contemporary Muslim countries, has actually abided by Sharia or any sort of like religious law in its entirety. That would be ridiculous. The difference here is that I even compared it to how Christians do not abide by Christian scripture as a mechanism to legislate. But of course, when it's Muslims, you have a different attitude about it. This distinction is Islamophobia. You are the one who is being inconsistent, and because you have no argument here, you just go, come on, bro. That's it. I agree with you, brother. No, you don't. You just said I cop out and I don't criticize Islam.
To return to the homes and land they lost, or, if they choose, be compensated. The Zionists have ignored this. As the Israeli High Court affirmed in the 70s, there is no Israeli nation separate from the Jewish people. Zionism essentially gives Jewishness a nationalist dimension and uses the Jewish identity and the historical discrimination tied to it to shield its ethno-supremacist and eliminationist aspirations. Funnily enough, the myths Zionism leans on often mirror the same ideas pushed by anti-Semites. See, the Jewish identity is widely understood as ethno-religious, with massive distinctions between different subgroups like European Ashkenazi Jews, Yemenite Jews, Middle Eastern Mizrahim more broadly, Ethiopian Jews, and so forth. But ultimately, these groups feel connected by their common faith, some practices, and historical narrative, even though, culturally, and for a long time prior to the revival of Israeli Hebrew, linguistically, they are very different. And as
Yes, Hebrew was a liturgical language and was not commonly utilized by Jews all around the world, with the exception of rabbinical texts. It was the post-Israeli nation-state project's goal to make Hebrew the national language or the international language of all Jews in general. And as a matter of fact, a big part of this also was the death of Yiddish. That's why when you see like in the United States of America, when you see like places that are places that you know, like Yiddish language school or things of that nature, a lot of times the people that are trying to keep Yiddish alive are met with resistance from those who promote Israel, those who are pro-Israel, like Jews who are pro-Israel.
historian Shlomo Sand argues, by transforming Jews into a nation or a race, the Zionist project heavily echoes anti-Semitic tropes. If there was no common cultural denominator among the communities of the Jewish religion, how could they be connected and set apart by ties of blood? Are the Jews an alien nation race, as the anti-Semites have imagined and sought to persuade us since the 19th century? What are the prospects of defeating this doctrine, which assumes and proclaims that Jews have distinctive biological features? In the past, it was Jewish blood. Today, it's a Jewish gene. When so many Israeli citizens are fully persuaded of their racial homogeneity. Another historical irony, there were times in Europe when anyone who argued that all Jews belonged to a nation of alien origin would have been classified at once as an anti-Semite. Nowadays, anyone who dares to suggest that the people known in the world as Jews, as distinct from today's Jewish Israelis, have never been and are still not a people or a nation, is immediately denounced as a Jew hater. Sand illustrates perfectly in that passage how Zionism not only harms Palestinians, who are very clearly its primary victims, but also Jews by weaponizing and bastardizing their identity and ultimately feeding into anti-Semitic tropes. Another example of how Zionism flirts with the same ideological space as Nazism comes from one of the movement's key figures, Zeev Jabotinsky, who openly expressed belief in unchangeable racial traits among Jews. A Jew,
Yeah, for the record, from Jabotinsky onward, the tradition of prominent Jewish thinkers who were Zionist and their similarities to literally at the time existing Nazis and now existing neo-Nazis has never really gone away. So if you think that like that one guy in the Israeli Knesset that has his own Wikipedia section dedicated to his Hitler quotes, his praise of Adolf Hitler is unique, he's not. Okay? He's not.
who brought up among Germans may assume German custom, German words. He may be wholly imbued with that German fluid, but the nucleus of his spiritual structure will always remain Jewish, because his blood, his body, his physical racial type.
Moshe Feiglin, yes, is who I'm talking about, who has his own, who has an entire segment of his Wikipedia page dedicated to his praise for Adolf Hitler. He is a former minister of the Knesset in Israel. He still praises Hitler to this day. I say former, he's no longer a minister of the Knesset, but he still praises Hitler to this day. He has said over and over again, just like the Nazis, like we have to ethnically cleanse Gaza, for example, as recently as like a couple months ago. Yeah. Feiglin considers himself to be a libertarian.
Jewish. It is impossible for a man to become assimilated with people whose blood is different from his own. And then he goes on a weird diatribe about how mixed marriages ruin racial purity. This is...
Which, again, I'm going to repeat this one more time. Interfaith marriages is seen with disdain by many Zionists, including the Apartheid Defense League's very own progressive, quote unquote, civil rights advocacy organization leader, Jonathan Greenblatt. You hear a white guy say that, you're like, that's crazy. That's crazy talk. What do you mean? You want to ban miscegenation? You want to ban race mixing? You want to keep your race and your ethno-religion pure? That seems weird. Interesting.
Nazi shit, nearly word for word. But again, Zionism is, at its core, a similarly ethno-supremacist ideology. There is no form of it that is benign or harmless. If Zionism were simply the idea that Jews should be able to live in Palestine, cool, I'd agree. Jews already lived in Palestine well before the European Zionist settlers showed up. That's not what Zionism is. By design, a quote-unquote Jewish state requires withholding equal rights from the non-Jewish people living there and legally enshrines ethno-supremacy. The non-Jewish elements ultimately serve as a contradiction to the project of Zionism and therefore must be done away with or subjugated. Funnily enough, the early Zionist settlers once viewed Holocaust survivors as contradictory to the project of Zionism because they reminded them of the diaspora Jew who they perceived as weak and antithetical to the new, heroic Jew they were trying to build in Israel. More on that in a later segment. Zionism's own founders and pioneers made it clear. Their goal was to build a nation state that serves Jewish interests exclusively.
Look at that.
A lot of October 8th Jews.
Is it your sense that Jewish people are getting complacent, that they're not engaging to the degrees and levels we should be?
I have met a lot of October 8th Jews for whom the massacre on October 7th was a wake-up call. I've met a lot of people who feel much more galvanized, much more organized. But that will only be sustained if we offer them, ways to participate in a real and robust way in Jewish life.
Mm-hmm. And whose responsibility is that? In essence?
All of ours.
Yeah.
But this is why we need a revolution in our community on so many levels. So look, the reality is that intermarriage rates continue to go up. Assimilation continues apace. And look, I fight anti-Semitism. That is my job. Right. But I worry a great deal about broader questions of Jewish identity, as I think we talked about over lunch.
Your sense?
It's really f***ed up, man. Too many shiksas. That's right. That's it. Too many shiksas coming in and sweeping up young Jewish men, and we got to put an end to it. It's awesome. Sounding like my grandpa now. Did he just say interfaith marriage is poisoning the blood of our nation? Pretty much. Yeah, he said the 14 words but Jewish, and he can still masquerade as a civil rights organization leader. So what he's talking about with October 8th Jews is like either anti-Zionist or liberal Zionist Jews that became incredibly hardened in their position after October 7 and became like super, super pro-Israel, which he, of course, sees as a good thing.
Exclusively at the expense of the indigenous Palestinian population, who they often described as backward or barbaric. They openly admitted that Zionism was a colonial project, which leads me to the next segment. Zionism is not colonialism. This is an incredibly easy one to refute, as I've already mentioned. The founders, pioneers, and important figures of Zionism openly referred to their aspirations as colonial. They even shamelessly used the word. Theodor Herzl, remember him from earlier, penned a letter to infamous colonizer Cecil Rhodes in 1902, where he asked for Cecil's help and openly referred to Zionism as something colonial. In the letter, Herzl can be seen asking Rhodes to put his stamp of authority on the Zionist plan. Keep in mind, Cecil Rhodes is like the LeBron James of doing colonization. But this wasn't the only time Herzl made clear his colonialist ambitions. In his famous pamphlet, The Jewish State, he wrote, "We should there, in Palestine, form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain..."
Damn, bro. This seems crazy. What? Ain't no way, dude. Ain't no way. What? Yeah, what the hell, LeBron James is right. What the heliante? What?
in contact with all of Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. Aside from Herzl, important Zionist figures like Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the founder of the revisionist Zionist movement, referred to Zionism as colonial an ungodly amount of times. Here's an excerpt from his essay, The Iron Wall, where he says, "We cannot offer any compensation for Palestine. Therefore, a voluntary agreement is unthinkable. Our colonization must either stop or continue against the will of the native population." As Rashid Khalidi put it, the social and economic institutions founded by the early Zionists, which were central to the success of the Zionist project, were also unquestioningly understood by all and described as colonial. The most important of these institutions was the Jewish Colonization Association. So the claim that Zionism is not colonialism is such pure cope given the fact that the pioneers of the movement, as well as many of its prominent figures, openly admitted that it was. Here's another example. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Yishuv, the Zionist settler society in Palestine.
It's funny because I brought, for people who were criticizing my Matt Duss conversation, like I brought all of this up to him when he tried to say that Zionism was not exterminationist in principle, and that the early Zionists who considered themselves to be Zionists, who wanted like a place for Jews to exist comfortably and peacefully, including Albert Einstein, would be now reflected on as anti-Zionists for the sentiments that they expressed before the inception of the nation state of Israel, like Albert fucking Einstein. Also, this is why I said the president of Moravia looked exactly like David Ben-Gurion, because he does. Look at this. In Superman, the president of Moravia was obviously like a holdover for Benjamin Netanyahu. That's fair. That's a fair assessment. Except he looked exactly like David Ben-Gurion.
Prior to Israel's founding, and later the country's first prime minister, viewed indigenous Palestinians and Arabs more broadly as inherently inferior. He made it clear that the Zionist movement was a European colonial project primarily concerned with the well-being of European Ashkenazi Jews. As historian Avi Shlaim noted, Ben-Gurion declared that the Jews in Muslim countries had lived in a society that was backward, corrupt, uneducated, and lacking in independence and self-respect. He argued that only the younger ones could be saved, claiming the older generation was too far gone and risked turning Israel into a Levantine state. It's also worth mentioning the form of colonialism that Zionism is. Not all types of colonial.
Isn't that dude? It's literally like, it's the same shit of like Americans, naming their missile systems Tomahawk. You know what I mean? First, they say these are barbaric savages. Then they ethnically cleanse the indigenous population, claim that they're barbaric savages. Then they turn around and they go, oh, Apache helicopters, Tomahawk missiles. It's the same shit. David Ben-Gurion, in the process of ethnic cleansing, says we must not become a Levantine culture. Once the ethnic cleansing campaign is unfolded, or at least the Israeli nation state is incepted, 75 years, 80 years later, what do Israelis say? Oh, what do you mean? We are a part of the Middle East. We are Levantine. Why? Why you hate Israel? Israel, very important part of Levantine culture. Meanwhile, in the initiation, and still to this day, a big part of the ethnic cleansing operations was the cultural erasure of Palestinians, the cultural erasure of any sort of like Levantine, any sort of Middle Eastern, any sort of Arab culture, forcibly. A part of the insidious nature of eco-fascism that Israel implements is literally the pay $1 to plant a tree in Israel project they have, right? The trees that they have planted, they've planted on top of the olive trees that they've burned down. Olive trees that take hundreds of years to develop, okay? They burn it down and they bring in invasive species because they want to make Israel at the time look more European.
Take the same shape, and some are arguably even more insidious. Zionism is settler colonial, which differs from classical colonialism. In classical colonialism, the goal is to control and exploit without replacing the local population. In settler colonialism, the goal is to replace the native population. Settlers come to stay and build a
America,
new society.
Australia,
They're often unwanted at home, and
Canada,
they're used by empires to expand influence by creating loyal outposts abroad. So as horrific as all other forms of colonialism are, settler colonialism is uniquely genocidal as it is predicated on what historian Patrick Wolfe deems the logic of elimination.
That's it.
Jews
That's
have
the
an
point.
ancient, exclusive claim to the land of Palestine because they were kicked out of it 2,000 years ago. This talking point goes hand in hand with the previous one, as some use it to argue that Zionism is actually a decolonial movement, reclaiming Palestine as the exclusive ancestral land.
So good. Such a stupid argument. Oh, such a stupid argument, dude. Oh, it's actually a decolonial movement. Israel was there 3,000 years ago. Okay, now you're killing the people that remained. You know what I mean? Great. Fantastic argument. Utterly delusional, okay? Woke fascism.
The Jewish people, which they claim was somehow colonized by Palestinians, but this is less rooted in historicity and more of a propaganda talking point. The idea of an unbroken, direct lineage between modern Jews and the ancient Israelites who were supposedly exiled from the Promised Land thousands of years ago, only to later return and negate the exile, is a common narrative among Zionists. It rests on the heavily debated presupposition that there is a direct, genetic, and exclusive connection between contemporary Jewish communities and the people of ancient...
Like, it doesn't even matter because there is no... This claim is utterly ridiculous, okay? You can't just be like, this is mine because it was mine 3,000 years ago, okay? It's so ridiculous because it's like, it's mine because it was mine 3,000 years ago. It's not yours, even though it was yours 75 years ago. What? The f do you mean? What are you talking about? That's not how anything works. Okay? That's insane. Okay, I'm Ottoman. It's mine. It's mine pre-World War I. Sorry. We're like, who gets to determine how far back we rolled that clock, you know? And it's so stupid because normies will actually say this without realizing how idiotic it sounds. Okay? My uncle works for Nintendo Tactic. Yeah. Greece wants Constantinople back? Yeah, exactly. Never going to happen. It's called Istanbul, little bro. Yeah, Bill Maher said it. And then he pointed to the Bible as the justification, which is awesome. Mr. Anti-Religion, edgy atheist. Every r/atheist after 9/11 became even more of a rabid Islamophobe, and that became their hyper focus. Some of them have actually converted back to Christianity, ironically enough, or have said idiotic things such as, well, I'm culturally Christian and I believe in like Christian superiority. But most of that just revolves around their genuine hatred for all things Islam, for the Islamic world in general, for the Muslim world in general, and also have, they've, in that, because of that prevailing principle, they are very pro-Israel, surprisingly, even though Israel bills itself as a religious ethno-state. Weirdly enough, Israel, the religious ethno-state for Jews, okay, is actually very good in the eyes of so many of these atheists. I wonder why. Perhaps it's because they just hate Islam, and if you use that as a justification to be like, no, I'm Islamophobic. What do you mean? I'm not afraid of the religion. I'm just a normal guy who hates barbaric, backwards Muslims who are dominated by religious dictate. That's the reason why I hate Islam, because they're all barbaric. Of course, the Jewish state has a right to exist. What are you, anti-Semitic? Like, come on.
in Israel. This is often accompanied by the claim that ancient Israel was once home to a powerful, united monarchy under Kings David and Solomon, and that modern Jews are its descendants. I guess some Zionists believe that descent from this united Israelite kingdom somehow strengthens their claim to the land of Palestine, but modern archaeology inconveniences this narrative. First, we'll challenge the idea that a power...
Archaeology plays a formative role in also developing the national project of Israel. Ironically enough, developing the myth around Israel. You know who also loved archaeology? The Nazis. You know who also had a busted, brain-broken national mythos that actually picked apart or engaged in the picking and choosing of different kinds of cultures? The Nazis. Hasan is only partially right about this. Explain what you mean about this. By the way, my overall point is this doesn't matter, okay? This is not an argument. It's a ridiculous argument to make. And the reason why I don't entertain it further is because, okay, what are you going to do? Do DNA tests? Go and trace your lineage back to ancient Canaanites or whatever the and it's Israel doesn't want to do that for obvious reasons. But even then, does it justify if it was the case, if the Israelis could trace their lineage, like the Israeli Jews or Jews all around the world could, painting the broad brush about atheists. Okay, shut up. I don't care about that. Yeah, no, the r/atheists deserve it. All of the biggest r/atheists became rabid Islamophobes. Give me a goddamn break. But in any case, as I was saying, even if you were to trace people's lineage back and all Jews all around the world were actually direct descendants of ancient Canaanites or people that lived in the land known as the Kingdom of Israel, right? In the land known as Israel, historically, biblical Israel, okay? Does that justify ethnic slaughter of the indigenous population that lives there? No, of course not. That's ridiculous, okay? That's crazy. That's crazy. That's crazy. That's crazy.
Powerful united monarchy of Israel ever even existed. Then, move on to the supposed unbroken genetic link between contemporary and ancient Jewish people. Israel Finkelstein, a prominent archaeologist at Tel Aviv University, argues in his book, The Bible Unearthed, that many monumental structures and cities traditionally dated to Solomon's era were misdated and should instead be attributed to the time of the Omride dynasty. This suggests that the so-called United Monarchy of Israel was more of a literary creation than a historical reality. The Bible Unearthed argues that this reading effectively negates the idea of a powerful and unified Israel.
It would matter to hardcore right-wing evangelicals? No, they're insane, dude. What are you, crazy? They're hallucinating. They think that if all Jews are sent to Israel and that the greater Israeli project is implemented, Jesus Christ is going to come back to earth and the rapture is going to happen and Jesus is going to fight the devil's forces in Megiddo. You can't convince some of those people with logic. They didn't arrive at that conclusion through logic. They arrived at that conclusion through huffing fumes, brother. They think an anime is taking place in the real world. Okay?
Israelite monarchy, because if the primary archaeological evidence is redated to a later period, then the basis for such a kingdom is removed, leading to reverberating implications. Finkelstein and his co-author Neil Asher Silberman go as far as to suggest that Kings David and Solomon, often imagined as the great monarchs of this ancient United Kingdom, were likely, in political terms, little more than hill country chieftains whose administrative reach remained on a fairly local level. As for the claim of an unbroken link between the supposedly exiled ancient Israelites and contemporary Jewish folk, that too is heavily debated and not so black and white. See, this particular form of nation building and narrativizing, the idea of coming from an ancient, respectable...
Hasan, you could argue that about all people of faith. I could. It's a matter of what that kind of quote-unquote faith gives you bandwidth to do, what kind of violence you get to do. As a matter of fact, I have consistently done this, like with Christian justifications for the maintenance of chattel slavery, for example, right? While also simultaneously showing that there is an alternative vision there as well, liberation theology. Christianity was on both sides of the slavery debate, both in the continuation of it and also in the extermination and the abolition of it. That's it. Religion is just a weapon to wield to galvanize the public.
Lineage is not unique to Israel. As historian Shlomo Sand puts it, just as the inhabitants of modern Greece saw themselves as the biological descendants of Socrates and Alexander the Great, and as influential textbooks have transformed the ancient Romans into typical Italians, the state of Israel equally engages with narratives to justify its existence and build up nationalist fervor about it. For Israelis, specifically those of Jewish origin, such mythologies, like those of the aforementioned Greeks and Italians, are far-fetched, whereas their own history rests on firm and precise truths. In Israel, these burdens of memory did not appear
The Bible. That's why Israel exists, because the Bible, you got owned.
spontaneously, but rather were piled layer upon layer by gifted reconstructors of the past. When occasional findings threatened the picture of an unbroken linear Jewish history, they were rarely cited. When they did surface, they were quickly forgotten, buried in oblivion. National exigencies created an iron-jawed vice that prevented any deviation from the dominant narratives. Many historians and scholars, including Shlomo Sand, go as far as to challenge the historicity of the supposed Roman exile of Jews in 70 CE and argue that it didn't happen. It was a myth. Sand is very firm in the belief that Romans did not deport entire peoples.
I think if you spam this video one more time, it'll work. Okay? If you spam it one more time, I think you're on the verge of me clicking it. Okay? It's like that pickaxe meme. You know, just one more hit with the pickaxe and you're going to reach the diamonds. One more time, dude. One more spam, dude. And we'll get there.
Especially in the Near East, and points out how that claim originally came from one historian whose knack for exaggeration has been noted by modern scholars. In actuality, the Jews emigrated from the land known today as Israel slowly and gradually over time, not due to some mass expulsion policy at the hands of the Romans. The Romans never had a mass expulsion policy. In fact, the dispersal of Jews...
Also, at that point, where would they be expelled to? More Rome? Like... the other areas that they were expelled to was also just more Rome.
Jews predated the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. By 70 CE, Jews had already been living elsewhere. Sand and co. argue that this myth was more so used to help transform adherents of the Jewish faith into a nation of people so as to serve nationalistic purposes. A close examination of the historical event that apparently engendered the second exile in the year 70 CE, and an analysis of the Hebrew term gola, exile, and its connotation in late Hebrew, indicate that the national historical consciousness was a patchwork of disparate events and traditional elements. Only in this way could it function as an effective myth that provided modern Jews with a pathway to ethnic identity. The ultra-paradigm of deportation was essential for the construction of a long-term memory wherein an imaginary, exiled people race could be described as the direct descendants of the former people of the Bible. The myth of uprooting and exile was fostered by the Christian tradition from which it flowed into Jewish tradition and grew to be the truth engraved in history.
It's a lot of post hoc mythological justifications that you create, some of which is real. Okay, tribalism is real, enmity and anti-Semitism is real, but like the development of this sort of thing is a relatively new phenomena. This is retconning of historic events that unfolded to tie it back to more modern versions, like even nation states. A lot of people, because our lifespans are so short, a lot of people living today in this day and age don't realize that up until a couple generations ago, the notion of a nation state was non-existent. Like, that's not a real thing. That's a new thing in the grand scheme of human history. Okay? We didn't have that. When people talk about like national projects and things of that nature, it's like, dude, you are literally talking about a blip. Okay? You're talking about a blip. Yeah, Italian wasn't really a concept until like 1840. And even then, those were warring amongst one another because they had city battles. And they still hold on to some of these gripes. Hasan is an anarchist now. No, I'm not an anarchist. I'm just explaining to you the concept of the modern nation state. It is a relatively new phenomena. It doesn't mean I'm a anarchist, okay? It's just an accurate it's an accurate retelling of history.
From which it flowed into Jewish tradition and grew to be the truth engraved in. Instead of a mass exile of Jews by the Romans, they actually stayed in the region and eventually
Yeah, that's the other point. Yeah, that's not a real thing. Some people left, some people remained. Some of the people remained and carried on the Jewish faith. A lot of the people first converted to Christianity and then to Islam. This is the other side of the story, which is like when Ashkenazi Jews or like European Jews that came to, or Levantine Jews that came from like MENA, the other parts of the MENA region to Israel that are like engaging in the wholesale ethnic slaughter of Palestinians that they call Arabs. They don't see the inherent irony that they are literally killing their own unbroken ancestors. But because the ideology has to revolve around something, and that in-group is Judaism, if you're non-Jew, then it's over. It doesn't matter if you could trace your ethnic lineage all the way back to the Canaanites. That's why it's also an idiotic argument.
converted to Islam, which opens up the door to the fact that Palestinians in Israel today.
So what if nation states are modern is where we're at? Wait, what? Do you think that I am like I understand that it is where we're at. I'm just simply explaining historic text with today's understandings and why that's actually dumb to do when reflecting on events that unfolded throughout history with like a modern lens. If you operate with the understanding of like nation states being a concept that existed throughout history, throughout time, then you're going to be wrong. Your understanding and your analysis of historical events that unfolded is going to be incorrect.
They can make a much stronger argument for their descendancy and ancient link to the land, especially in comparison to figures like Ben Gurion and Golda Meir, whose ancestry for generations comes from Eastern Europe. However, as Sand responsibly reminds us, any population that has existed in a region for thousands of years has mingled with its neighbors, its captives, or its conquerors.
You know about Israelis, same as 2-year-old on whiskey? What does that even mean? Are you saying that my understanding of Israel and Israelis is the same as a 2-year-old who's drunk off whiskey? Is that what you're trying to say? No politique here. Do not talk about this.
So making these grand historical arguments of unbroken genetic links and soul descent as a way to argue for an exclusive claim to a land is not something serious historians should be entertaining. Sand goes on to show how, by referring to the work of scholar Chaim Milikowski dealing with contemporary rabbinical sources, the term exile in the 2nd and 3rd century CE originally referred to political subjugation, not deportation. He then builds off the works of historian and professor at Hebrew University Israel Yuval and explains how the renewed Jewish myth about the exile in fact arose fairly late and was due mainly to the rise of Christian mythology about the Jews being exiled in punishment for their rejection and crucifixion of Jesus. Sand goes on to write, "The myth of exile began to be slowly appropriated and integrated into Jewish tradition. With the triumph of Christianity in the early 4th century CE, when it became the religion of the empire, Jewish believers in other parts of the world also began to adopt the notion of exile as divine punishment. The concept of exile took an outright metaphysical connotation within Jewish traditions, going far beyond simply being away from one's homeland. Exile, in fact, was anywhere, even in the Holy Land." This clearly illustrates how exile was originally less a material descriptor in Jewish tradition, but more so a metaphorical one that later became crucial in selling the Zionist project by transforming it into a story of physical displacement and the need to return to Zion. Sand's argument is not that Jewish people didn't suffer or weren't historically mistreated. It's that the idea of a mass, uniform expulsion is less rooted in accurate history and more so a post hoc construction to help create the idea of a single, unified people race that is now weaponized by the Zionist project. He then goes on to argue that the migration and incredible growth of the worldwide Jewish population over centuries is better explained by conversion to Judaism rather than by direct descent from the ancient Israelites. He reminds us that Judaism did, at one point, actively engage in proselytizing. Nur Mashalha corroborates this claim in his 2018 book, Palestine, A 4,000-Year History. But to wrap this section up, even if everything Sand, Finkelstein, and all the other historians put forth is proven to be incorrect in the face of some new hypothetical evidence, that wouldn't change the fact that the ancient Israel argument is a bad argument. Even if there really was a united Israelite monarchy and today's Jewish people were the sole direct descendants of an ancient exiled group, that still wouldn't justify an exclusive claim to the land. No one would accept that argument in any other context. Do I, as an Italian with a grandparent from Rome, have a historical claim to London because it was once part of the Roman Empire? I'd hope you'd say no. If some guy showed up to your house and claimed that his ancestors lived there 2,000 years ago, we would all agree that he's got no case. But the thing that Zionists rely on to make their exclusive claim to the land is not so much logical or historical, but biblical. God gave the land of Palestine to the Jewish people exclusively. For this segment, I set my sights on the Hebrew Bible so we can get right to the source of God's word. A fundamental principle articulated in the Torah is that the land ultimately belongs to God, not any single people in perpetuity. Leviticus 25:23 represents God's wishes and states clearly, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. You are strangers and sojourners with me." This verse reframes the connection of the Israelites to the land as one of stewardship rather than outright ownership. The Israelites' relationship to the land is portrayed as conditional in the Bible, based on covenantal obedience, not absolute ownership. And given that the Israelis today break almost all of God's rules, from killing to theft to occupation, I'd say they aren't being all too obedient at the moment. There is no divine, unconditional right to the land given by God in the Bible. Deuteronomy 28 lists blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience, stating that those who disobey God's covenant are to be exiled from the land. As Leviticus 18:28 reaffirms, the Israelites are to be vomited out if they break the covenant or defile the land. I would say that constantly bombing the daylights out of your holy land probably counts as defiling it, and doing a genocide most likely is not in compliance with the covenant.
Yeah, I don't even entertain the theological arguments anyway. I think it's nonsensical. But, you know, there is definitely also a theological counter argument to everything that Israel is doing, because everything that Israel is doing is bad. And religion is supposed to be a social text, like a rule book of, you know, what best practices to follow. And therefore, it's going to say things like, don't murder people, don't steal from people. You know, that's kind of the whole game, right? Therefore, you're automatically disqualifying if you are engaging in some kind of nation-state project that requires the extermination of people that were living there before you implemented this settler colonial operation.
Given that bloodshed and murder are constantly portrayed as defiling or polluting the land, as is shown in Numbers 35, 33 through 34. Clearly, the land is depicted as morally reactive and willing to expel the unjust. Aside from all this, the biblical text also contains provisions for the inclusion of non-Israelites. In Ezekiel 47, 22 through 23, God's vision of a restored Israel commands that the land be divided as an inheritance for both the Israelites and the strangers who sojourn among you, and that these strangers shall be to you as native born among the children of Israel. They shall have an inheritance with you among the tribes of Israel. This passage directly contradicts the idea of an ethnically exclusive right to the land. Another point worth mentioning here is that Zionists rely heavily on this biblical superstitious talking point, but ignore the fact that many of the pioneers of political Zionism were secular or atheists. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the pre-state settler society in Palestine and later the first
A national socialist, if you will. That's what he was. And much like historic national socialists, he focused primarily on the nationalism aspect and not so much on the socialism aspect. Does that remind you of a guy? Certainly reminds me of a guy, you know?
Prime Minister of Israel openly referred to himself as an atheist, which reminds me of this pertinent quote from Ilan Pappé. The secular Jews who founded the Zionist movement wanted paradoxically both to secularize Jewish life and to use the Bible as a justification for colonizing Palestine. In other words, they did not believe in God, but he, nonetheless, promised them Palestine. Israel was formed due to the Holocaust. This is a common talking point, but it's inaccurate. The Zionist movement that colonized Palestine started way before the Holocaust. In the late 1800s, the first Zionist settlers arrived in Palestine in 1882 in a wave of immigration called the First Aliyah. The next wave of immigration, the Second Aliyah, took place after, and the settlers...
So the first Aliyah, I assume he's going to talk about like how they bought like land and stuff, which you know what, I'll just let him do it as a matter of fact, because that's true, they did. There were purchase land agreements. This is not wrong, okay? It just, again, doesn't justify the ethnic expulsion of the people that live there. So that is also an idiotic argument, an idiotic line of argumentation.
Consisted mostly of...
And that land in and of itself was a tiny fraction of the land that Israel now occupies.
Frustrated communists and socialists who now saw Zionism not only as a solution for the Jewish problem, but also as spearheading communism and socialism through collective settlement in Palestine. As Pape put it, many of these Jewish settlers were victims of anti-Semitism in Europe. But as we've already established, Zionism was not a popular solution to the problem of anti-Semitism among Jewish people at the time. Many believed that communism would better alleviate their issues by remedying class disparities and eventually solving anti-Semitism in Europe. The Bundists, a Jewish socialist group from the late 1800s, rightfully understood from the jump that Zionism would, in the long run, actually harm
my goats, okay? The Bundists, the Bolsheviks, the real goats.
The Jewish plight more than anything. And they were right. Zionism is a failed project. A Jew in Israel is certainly less safe than they would be almost anywhere else in the world. Miller Burroughs wrote, "Until fairly recently, Reformed Judaism was on the whole anti-Zionist. The colonization of Palestine and the subjugation of the locals was in effect long before the rise of the Nazi regime in Europe. In fact, in post-war Israel, Holocaust..."
Like, one of the craziest aspects of this is like, look, I'm no Philo-Semite by any means, okay? Having said that, like, Jews, due to their collective history of oppression, wholesale slaughter, pogroms, the Holocaust, have always found themselves on at the tip of the spear in revolutionary politics, okay? Maybe because they were pushed into that position. Most likely because they were pushed into that position, let's be real, because it's always like the same tribalist forces that have required Jews to be the ancient enemy, right? So if you literally look at Jewish history pre-Israel versus Jewish history post-Israel, and the way that the Zionist project has basically glanced over the much longer Jewish history, it makes no sense. It's just like a full tilt. It's a complete adoption of every single type of politics that Jews have historically fought against. It's so goddamn annoying. And it's crazy because like the real anti-Semitism that Nazis and neo-Nazis have to this day is because they hate that revolutionary politics that Jews have played a formative role in. It's so up. An honest assessment of Jewish history would require talking about the thousands of years of revolutionary politics as opposed to the last 80 years of fascism. That's what's so insane and so frustrating about it. That's what you should be learning in like Jewish camp and Jewish school, not all of the myth making and the the national religion of Judaism that it's become, or the way that they teach it, is like Zionism as the national religion for many secular Jews, many Reformed Jews now. Because a state, especially one that can be presented as quote unquote progressive, is much easier to create a sense of identity and a sense of community around than abiding by old traditions and like consistent rules that you have to follow.
Survivors were often shamed for not resisting more forcefully, as Zionists saw them as symbols of weakness. Historian Tom Segev relays this phenomenon in his work, The Seventh Million, where he writes, "The Zionist dream conceived of a new man in a new society who would come to the land of Israel in search of personal and national salvation. Those who came only because they had no other choice, however, did not fit this image and often found themselves objects of condescension and contempt. This paradox was built into Zionist ideology and colored the mentality of the Yishuv. Though most of the immigrants from Germany and their children after them stayed in Israel, most did indeed come against their will as refugees. They were not Zionists. As a result, they found themselves from the start in conflict with the fundamental values of the Yishuv. They were called Hitler Zionists." So not only was Israel not founded on the heels of the Holocaust, but early Zionist settlers openly thought of Holocaust survivors as a contradiction to the project of Zionism. According to Segev, only later, when Israel needed to start to prove its right to exist, did the Zionist narrative shift to embracing the Holocaust. As I've mentioned many times, the creation and maintenance of Israel relies on nation-building narratives, one of which casts the new Israeli Jew as strong and heroic.
I think the irony of this process, by the way, is that I think partially because of the importance of the Holocaust in like justifying the existence of the contemporary Israeli state, there's been a lot of efforts by Zionists to make sure that you talk about the Holocaust, that you learn about the lessons of the Holocaust. And the primary lesson of the Holocaust is never again. Except for some, that means never again for Jews and Jews only, right? But for everybody else, for the most part, the lesson is never again across the board. And therefore, now that Israel is doing it again, okay, the again part of never again, many people who learn that lesson, who learn that social conditioning, look at what Israel is doing in horror. That's it. Because I do believe that the Holocaust would be treated as like the Armenian genocide if there wasn't an association with the development of a settler colonial state that plays a formative role in Western imperialism in the region. This isn't to like undermine the atrocity in and of itself. Make no mistake, right? But just like I said, a lot of like the impact of Jewish advocacy organizations, the combating of anti-Semitism, the real reason why this group has had any sort of motion in being able to target and actively push back against marginalization in modern history is because of its utilization as a shield, as a weapon to wield against critics of the settler colonial apparatus. Never again is a messed up double meaning to the muscular understanding of Jews. It means we must do all, including the worst crimes, to ensure that nothing befalls the Jewish people ever again. To everyone else, it means that humanity should never stoop to such lows as the Holocaust again. Yeah, exactly. But what you're saying here, this interpretation, I think, is like, again, was a specific interpretation. It was like a Kahanis interpretation almost. Whereas now I think it's become more commonplace, especially post October 7. Like I see liberal Zionists also say never again means just the Jews. Like that we can never allow this to happen to Jews again, which is why we have to do everything in our power to be as muscular and as militant, you know?
as opposed to the so-called weak Jew of the past who found himself resigned to the ghetto. The apathy toward Holocaust survivors in Israel is represented by the devastating fact that 1 in 3 survivors live in poverty to this day. You would think that a state that was supposedly formed in response to one of the most horrific tragedies of all time would uphold Holocaust survivors as the heroes that they are.
In 1948, Ben-Gurion, who mockingly called Jewish Holocaust survivors Sabanim soaps, desperately sent an army contingent consisting of Holocaust survivors that attacked the heavily fortified Jordanian position in Latrun as a military diversion so that his Haganah elite forces would reach West Jerusalem. He knew that the contingent of Holocaust survivors would be slaughtered, but he let it happen. Avi Shlaim has a chapter on it. I think a lot of the muscular Judaism comes from Jabotinsky's writings and influence. I mean, yeah, but that's also, like, its modern interpretation is also elevated to contemporary discourse by Meir Kahan, a direct through line from Jabotinsky to Kahan to the Ben-Gvirs of the world now.
And not make fun of them or allow them to live in destitution. The truth is, the Zionist project looked down on the Jews who lived outside the newly formed state of Israel, including Holocaust survivors, and instead idealized the new Israeli Jew, which they referred to as the Sabra.
Yes, soaps is, of course, an incredibly anti-Semitic Holocaust reference, for the record, for those who didn't understand that point.
Sabra was crafted as the antithesis of what was considered the diaspora Jew. The Sabra was meant to be strong, heroic, and above all, a product of the state of Israel. The Zionists resented Holocaust survivors for the mere fact that they threatened the image of the Sabra. The Sabra represented a national ideal, and the Holocaust survivor its reverse.
Yeah. This is another, like, completely insane aspect of the muscular militant Jew national mythos surrounding the Israeli nation state, which mistreats Holocaust survivors because there is this, once again, ahistorical approach, this entirely ahistorical approach, the idea that, like, Jews were weak, the Jews that were slaughtered in the Holocaust were weak, and they just, like, didn't want to fight back, not recognizing that, like, many of them, there's a reason why they brought their clothes with them, thinking that this was going to be not a death camp, but instead like a concentration camp that would inevitably relocate them there, that they were not sent to these places without while with the full understanding that they're going to be killed and wholesale slaughtered, or that Jews did not play a formative role in the resistance movement against Nazis, whether it be the partisans or numerous other revolutionary organizations, Jews in other countries like the Jews in the USSR. So that also is ahistorical, and it's bullshit. And that's part of the reason why it's just like they pick and choose what aspects of the Holocaust they want to highlight. And even in that process, they also bastardize the accurate reflection of events in an effort that justifies the existence of the Israeli nation state.
Some Zionist figures at the time actually considered the persecution and extermination of European Jews to be punishment for their trying to assimilate into European society. Some even referred to them as mice in flight. Not exactly the most respectful attitude toward the victims of anti-Semitism. Now, even if it were true that Israel was formed solely in response to the Holocaust, which it wasn't, would that somehow justify the displacement, genocide, and apartheid inflicted on Palestinians? Of course not. Why should a completely unrelated group of people who had nothing to do with the Holocaust pay for it with their land, homes, and lives? Muslims have always been irredeemably anti-Semitic, so they can't coexist with Jews.
These are situations that involve, a group of people, Muslims and Jews, that have effectively been at each other's throats.
Whoa, dude, that's the engineer, big dog. Overzealots. I'll have you know you're going after a fellow Canadian who is, as a matter of fact, an engineer. Put some respect on his commentary here, okay? He's a Middle East engineer, dude.
for not just decades, but hundreds of years. You were talking about hundreds of years of like just institutional dislike between each other.
This is nothing more than a historical inaccuracy that is weaponized today to justify apartheid and occupation as though they are merely the outcomes of ancient immutable hatreds and not.
Here, by the way, this is from the Jerusalem Post. Building a state in the shadow of the Holocaust. On reaching Israel, Kleiger indeed found a gulf in understanding between native Israelis and Holocaust survivors. They didn't know how to handle us. They called us soaps, he says with a wry laugh, because they heard that Germans made soap with the fat of our victims, which is not true, by the way. Not the first time an Israeli leader has entertained Nazi Holocaust revisionism, or even, believed the Nazis, I guess. The influx of Holocaust survivors was a collision of two worlds. They were a different people. They were a people born free, he says. For years, we were not free at all, but they were always free. This person is also a Zionist, mind you. Make no mistake. I mean, this is the Jerusalem Post. One of the most maddeningly stupid American ideas is that the Israeli-Palestine conflict is about an immutable, centuries-long hatred between Muslims and Jews. And they just fight all the time. It's Orientalist in nature. And I find it really funny because it also orientalizes Judaism, which is the idea that these non-Christians, they've been warring for a real long time. It is what it is. Have you ever used an argument against someone you disagree with, or you just called them Nazis and pedos? Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do all the time. And I've done it 100 times since the beginning of this video. And the only time I call someone a Nazi or a pedophile is usually when they are a Nazi or a pedophile, sometimes both. It's not my fault that many of the naysayers, given my anti-Nazi, anti-pedophilia position, happen to be Nazi pedophiles. Do you think that it's an entire stream of me going, this person is a Nazi, this person is a pedophile? Or do you think that there's some convincing arguments that I'm making in the process? Also, the irony here is I'm literally talking about historic Nazism when we're talking about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. What language am I supposed to use when talking about the Holocaust that the Nazis did? Am I supposed to use a different term? Come on, man. Why are you calling Adolf Hitler a Nazi? Did he call himself a Nazi?
Deliberate policy decisions. The truth is that the Middle East, prior to the rise of European colonialism and later Zionism in the late 19th and early 20th century, saw coexistence between Jews, Christians, and Muslims that shouldn't be swept under the rug. If we take a look at the Ottoman Empire, which at its height ruled over 250 million people across three
glorious
continents, it was known for its pragmatic approach to dealing with the minorities living within it. Instead of forcing one legal or cultural.
At least when is a swagged out white boy from Canada engaging in an accurate reflection of history as it pertains to the Ottoman Empire, they won't say he's like a neo-Ottoman supremacist or whatever the
system on everyone. The empire let its non-Muslim subjects govern themselves through communities called millets. These were based on religion, not race or ethnicity.
Millet, by the way, means literally nation state or a people.
Now, this was far from a liberal or tolerant system. However, for its time, it was relatively progressive. The millet system was born out of pragmatism first and foremost. The Ottoman leadership believed that by outsourcing the governance of its minorities to those communities themselves, they could focus on things like security, tax collection, and so forth. Under the millet system, Jewish communities had a high level of autonomy, handling things like marriage, divorce, and inheritance in their own religious.
So like autonomous zones? No, not exactly. Because it spanned across so many different cultures and so many different ethnicities, so many different religions, due to, as overzealots correctly identified, the pragmatism of being able to control such a wide swath of land, the Ottomans decided, unlike a lot of Christian empires, that the best possible way was not through forcible conversion, but instead to just allow people to govern themselves, and then and in the process just let localities engage in. No, it's not even a self-segregation thing. No, not at all. It's just if you're You have your own local form of governance. As long as you pay jizya, as long as you pay a tax to the empire, nobody gives a shit. Didn't the Persian Empire do this? Yes. Empires that have succeeded for very long periods of time have done a version of this, whether it be the Roman Empire or whether it be the Persian one as well. I would say that this is ones that haven't done this are newer. Yeah. There's two different mechanisms here. Either you like forcibly convert people, right? Every single person in that land, and you like try to engage in cultural erasure and destroy their identity, or you have a more somewhat tolerant approach to the process as opposed to the forcible conversion and allow people to believe whatever the fuck they want to believe as long as they are like under the imperial banner. I was going to say under the banner of the nation state, which didn't exist at the time. So like, obviously it's like, you're part of the Ottoman Empire. You do whatever the fuck you want to do. This is part of the reason why at the time in the Christian, Western societies, while Jews were constantly getting singled out and getting destroyed, in pogroms, the Ottoman Empire, whether it be the Spanish Inquisition and onward, the Ottoman Empire was seen as a safe haven for Jews. And many Jews actually went into this region directly as a consequence of that.
Courts led by their own rabbis. The Ottoman state not only allowed this, but often stepped in to protect it, helping preserve Jewish cultural and religious life. Within the legal framework of the Ottoman Empire, non-Muslims were considered dhimmi, meaning protected people. Although Jews and other minorities were treated better under Ottoman rule as opposed to the way Jews were treated in Europe, the dhimmi system was still ultimately a system predicated on subordination. But again, for its time, it was relatively progressive. Dhimmi status—
Oh no, for sure. It was woke as opposed to the way other, I mean, yeah, you got Inquisition on the one side and you got the Ottoman Empire on the other side. Yeah, of course, it's going to look like a safe haven because it was. So they did not discriminate, but they call them protected people. Like, Muslims have to serve in the military, and non-Muslims specifically have a different role to play in the military through the devshirme program, and not just the military, but like to the highest positions in Ottoman society. Like, some of the best Ottoman historical figures are literally non-Muslims that came from the devshirme program. Some of the greatest pieces of architecture that was designed were designed by people from the devshirme program, and which is, again, by today's understanding, a horrifying practice. You're literally taking kids at an early age and putting them in a farm program. Basically, you're like scouting non-Muslim children to Mimar Sinan is the example I was thinking of. Like the Janissaries as well. Rather Turkish than papist is a Dutch Christian reformist saying in the 1500s. Yeah, the first historic black pilot in the world is Ahmet Ali Çelik'ten, and I only found out about it later, but he flew in 1914 in World War I.
This was basically a deal. Non-Muslims could live, worship, and keep their property in peace as long as they stayed loyal to the state and paid a special tax called the jizya, which also got them out of military service.
Yeah.
Another point that is imperative to understand is that Jews were not subordinated on the basis of their Jewish identity. They were subordinated for not being Muslim. Christians were too. Jews and Christians were also allowed to convert to Islam under Ottoman rule and rid themselves of dhimmi status, an offer not available to Jews living in, say, Germany, whose Jewishness was perceived to be in their blood and immutable. Funnily enough, that sort of transformation from religious group to quasi-racial group is also parroted by the Zionists. Remember that Jabotinsky quote from earlier? The one about Jewishness being in the blood and intrinsic? Anyway, back to the Ottoman Empire. By the 19th century, the Ottomans entered a period of reform called the Tanzimat from 1839 to 18...
This is where homosexuality was decriminalized. It was never criminalized prior, but it was decriminalized in the books.
1876, aimed at modernizing the state. It focused on centralizing power, updating the military, and shifting from a religiously divided system to a more secular idea of equal Ottoman citizenship. The Tanzimat era kicked off with bold reforms and decrees that redefined how the Ottoman state related to its people. The first major step was the 1839 Noble...
His grandson is a Hasanabi head? Wait, what? Do you know that? No shot. No way. Is that for real? Does he still live in Turkey? I don't know if you're making that up. That'd be dope.
Edict of the Rose Chamber. This imperial decree was a turning point in Ottoman history. It guaranteed all subjects the security of their life, honor, and property. It also called for fair taxation, a more just system of conscription, and most importantly, declared Muslims, Jews, and Christians equal before the law. This was followed by the 1850...
Yeah, this is why the Ottoman Empire fell, because they went woke. Go woke, go broke, dude. That's true. Whoever said that in the chat, I agree with you.
1956 Imperial Rescript, which doubled down on equal rights, formally scrapped the jizya tax, and effectively ended the dhimmi system, pushing the idea of a shared Ottoman citizenship. For Jews and other minorities, this marked a turning point, offering new legal rights and a path to full civic inclusion. Let's stop to note that the 1856 Ottoman Empire treated Jews better than 2025 Israel treats Palestinians. Now, don't take this as me saying that the Ottoman Empire was some kind of humanistic paradise.
Yeah, DEI killed another empire, just like the Roman Empire.
That's not my point. They did plenty of horrific and rotten shit. The Armenian genocide comes to mind, but what I am saying is that during this period, Jews experienced a level of coexistence and peace with their neighbors that was unmatched in Europe, especially during the Tanzimat reforms. This upward momentum for Jewish people could be seen in the way they thrived and succeeded in places like Iraq. Jews have been in the land that came to be known as Iraq for ages. By the early 1900s, they made up a huge chunk, about a third of Baghdad's population. This long history is part of what led to their sense of belonging in the region. Historian Avi Shleim, an Iraqi Jew who grew up in that community, says Jews were neither newcomers nor outsiders. Definitely not intruders. Jews were early trailblazers in modernizing Iraq. They even opened the first modern school in Baghdad back in 1864. Jewish people also assumed prominent roles in finance and trade. They were so central to their community's way of life that, as Shleim recalls, the major markets in Baghdad would shut down on Saturdays in observance of the Jewish Sabbath. And as Ottoman rule ended and British rule began, the new Iraqi constitution of 1924 further solidified the legal status of Jews in the region as full and equal citizens. Jews went on to have seats in parliament.
So was Greater Israel just the Ottoman Empire? It used to be, yes. As a matter of fact, Theodor Herzl, before going to European colonists, went to the Ottoman Empire outright to say, give me this area. And of course, the answer was no.
And positions at all levels of civil service. The Iraqi community even appointed a Jewish man as their first minister of finance. Sir Sassoon Haskel was his name, and he was responsible for negotiating fair oil deals with the British. Just goes to show that the community had immense faith in and respect for him. Avi Shleim and scholar Ella Shohat have touched heavily on the concept of the Arab Jew throughout their careers, arguing that it's a relatively recent phenomenon to view Arab and Jew as mutually exclusive categories. In their eyes, this shift is largely chalked up to the Zionist project and the division such a colonial endeavor sowed in the region and among...
That's why I always talk about the designation. Whenever talking about like Israeli polls that come out that classify Israeli society as two different groups, Jew and Arab, I always say this is the Israeli state's own designation, even though there are a fuck ton of Arab Jews. They're classified as Jews, okay? Sephardic and Mizrahi, specifically Mizrahi Jews, are a specific subcategorization to elevate Arab Jews to the status of Jew rather than the status of Arab. That's why people who are, pro-Palestine or people who are real ball knowers will always say those are Palestinian citizens of Israel when talking about the Israeli classification of Arab. Arab just means non-Jew.
Amongst otherwise coexisting groups. I lived in an Arab country, which formed the social reality for my family in Baghdad. We only spoke Arabic at home. Our lifestyle, culture, and literature were Arab. Our music was a blend of Jewish and Arabic music. We had much more in common with Muslim Iraqis and Christian Iraqis than we had with our co-religionists from Eastern Europe. In this very real existential and cultural sense, we were Arab Jews. I know the notion is controversial, and Israelis say it's an impossibility.
Yeah, Israelis get real butthurt. Israelis get real butthurt when you say, bro, you're from, like, your family is from Iraq, or your family is from, insert Arab country. So, like, how can you say you're in a different, how are you categorized as this? And it's like,
but I don't see why, Schleim says. He even goes as far as to say that Jews of Arab lands are actually another victim of Zionism, after the Palestinians, of course. This is worth mentioning because Zionists will argue that the Jews from the MENA region were primarily victimized by Arab nationalism or Arab anti-Semitism, which gave rise to Zionism.
The Arabs created 1 million Zionists because they're anti-Semitic.
In actuality, the division and hostility that formed in the MENA region and the Arab nationalism that was born out of it was a response to Zionism, not the other way around. We'll expand on this topic as we address the next Zionist talking point, the double Nakba. Also,
how true is that? I mean, it is patently false. It's ahistorical. Overzealous has made an entire video just dedicated to that insane statement. The comparison between a planned ethnic expulsion campaign and ethnic cleansing campaign, planned Dalit, that the early Zionist brigades cooked up to numerous different countries going through their own pan-Arabic nationalist movements, okay, in order to develop a nation state, and the animosity they felt and the bigotry that they expressed towards Jewish people in said countries in the aftermath of the Nakba is ridiculous. The difference, of course, between the duality of Islamophobia, or the double standard between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, is that you can say that about Arabs as a monolithic force or Muslims as a monolithic force, and no one reads it as like an incredibly racist statement. But of course, if you say that about Jews, then everybody understands that that is anti-Semitic and completely not permissible. The difference, of course, is that both are not permissible forms of bigotry.
Referred to as the Jewish Nakba.
If the Jews didn't come from Europe after the Holocaust, they came from the surrounding Arab countries that expelled them in massive amounts following the 1948 war. In fact, there was more Jews displaced than Palestinians during the Nakba.
The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which people with limited competence in a particular...
This talking point attempts to convince you that there was a uniform mass expulsion of Jewish people from the MENA region following the 1947 partition of Palestine and the subsequent 1948 war for Palestine. Often referred to as the Jewish Nakba or the double Nakba, this narrative is a propaganda tool aimed at diminishing the severity of the Palestinian Nakba by falsely equating it with the experience.
It's so crazy because, like, we've explained this, so many people much more knowledgeable than myself, and I have also attempted to try and explain this concept to both Ethan and other people that engage in this kind of idiotic propaganda, and yet they just like never understand it. Like half of the countries that Ethan presents in his context puke, which I obviously went through in great detail on my YouTube page as well, if you want to go and watch that, it's like 8 hours long, are countries that didn't even have autonomy. Like they didn't have any sort of like real national sovereignty. They were like under the banner of French colonial occupation, for example. You know what I mean? So the notion that this was like a similar planned expulsion of Jews from all of these other countries that Arabs were in control of is insane.
of Jews in the MENA region. By advancing this dishonest claim, the Zionist project seeks to deflect criticism of its ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, shifting the focus to a supposed symmetrical event of Jewish displacement. In doing so, it attempts to absolve itself of blame and avoid responsibility for honoring the Palestinian right of return or providing compensation for what they lost. Avi Shlaim has a powerful passage refuting this harmful narrative in his book 3 Worlds, where he writes, "The purpose of this narrative is to create a false symmetry between the fate of two communities. This narrative is not history, it's the propaganda of the victors. Honest history has to acknowledge the part played by all the governments concerned in causing this man-made tragedy. The main difference is that the Palestinian refugees, for the most part, were ethnically cleansed by the Israeli armed forces, whereas the Arab Jews, with a few exceptions, were given by the Arab governments the option of leaving or staying." This sentiment is corroborated by Israeli historian Tom Segev, who wrote, "Deciding to emigrate to Israel from one of the Arab countries was often a very personal decision, as it was in Europe. It was based on the particular circumstances of the individual's life. They were not all poor or dwellers in dark caves and smoking pits, nor were they always subjected to persecution, repression, or discrimination in their native lands. They immigrated for a variety of reasons, just as the ones who had immigrated from Europe, depending on the country, the time, the community, and the person." This suggests that Middle Eastern and North African Jews experienced a range of different living circumstances. Some were bad, some were relatively normal, in the words of Mossad agent Ephraim Shiloh, who visited North Africa to gauge the situation for himself. The double Nakba theory ultimately transforms the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, or the Mizrahim, into a bargaining chip for the Zionist movement, a movement they, for the most part, originally wanted little to do with. This talking point erases the Mizrahim's rich, unique identities and, as Ella Shohat argues, imposes an Arab versus Jew binary. The double Nakba narrative relies on a racialized and monolithic understanding of both Arabs and Jews. It imagines a unified Arab world acting in concert to expel a unified Jewish people, which just isn't the case. In reality, Jewish emigration from many countries took place over the course of decades for many different reasons. And once those North African or Middle Eastern Jews made it to Israel, they were horribly mistreated by the racist Ashkenazi establishment. They were viewed as backward, primitive, and frequently referred to as bad human material, but more on that in a bit. This migration of Mizrahi Jews was triggered largely due to colonial Zionist settlers taking over Palestine and ethnically cleansing the native population, resulting in a reaction by other Arab communities in the region. Furthermore, the Zionist movement played a key role in speeding up the immigration of Middle Eastern Jews to Palestine. They did so through various methods, ranging from secret deals with heads of states all the way up to false flag bombing campaigns in which Zionist actors would bomb Jewish targets in Muslim-majority countries and then blame the attacks on Muslims to instill panic and accelerate Jewish migration to Palestine. And don't worry, we will go into detail about this soon. Those who use the double Nakba talking point often leave out how the Zionist movement and the State of Israel actively put Jews across the region in positions of immense danger in order to create hostile environments for them and ultimately...
Are Arab Jews persecuted in Israel? No, not any longer. They have firmly been made a part of the in-group due to the subcategorization that we just talked about, which is that there's Arab and then there's Jew in Israel. So all of the Mizrahi population are considered a part of the Jewish in-group. There is still some level of discrimination against the like Ethiopian Jews and black Jews in general, but it's a much larger. The much larger discrimination exists against Palestinian citizens of Israel, what the Israeli government considers to be Arab by its own designation. So non-Jews, Christians and Muslims.
convinced them to move to Palestine. To quote...
Like, if you want to understand how stupid this designation is, like, Armenians are considered Arab in Israel, okay? The Armenians, Christian Armenians, are considered Arab under the Israeli demographics. That's how stupid it is.
Pape. The Holocaust destroyed European Jewish communities, leaving the population at 1/3 of its previous size. Moreover, most of the Jews in the US and Britain did not emigrate to Israel. They were too comfortable at home. That meant that the Zionists had to look east to populate their new Jewish state. But it was not easy to convince Arab Jews to leave countries in which they had, in many cases, been settled for centuries, if not millennia. They had prospered there, they had little experience of anti-Semitism, and felt as Arab as their neighbors. Zionists had to resort to an aggressive campaign of persuasion, often resorting to underhanded methods. Furthermore, the Jews who did move to Palestine were able to appropriate Palestinian land and property, while the Palestinians got ethnically cleansed and relegated to refugee status in perpetuity. These two situations are not symmetrical. So for this segment, we will look over specific countries in the MENA region and detail how exactly their Jewish populations withered away. This will illustrate that Jewish displacement in the region was a slow, prolonged process and the result of many different primary causes, far from this imagined synchronous expulsion of Jews by Muslims. Before we get into the specifics, it is important to understand that Jewish communities did suffer in the MENA region as a result of the Zionist movement and the animosities that flared up as a consequence. No one in their right mind would deny such a thing. There were some who wrongfully took the bait and conflated their Jewish populations with Zionism, which is exactly what the founding figures of Zionism wanted. Herzl can be quoted saying, "The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries are allies." However, it's important to understand that this hostility was a reaction. This was cause and effect, not indicative of some primordial, intrinsic Arab anti-Semitism. It was the result of geopolitics. Last thing to keep in mind before we get going is that many of these MENA countries were under colonial rule during this time, so instead of just two state actors, Israel and whatever MENA country is in question, there was a third point on that triangle, the colonial power, typically France or Britain. In many cases, the colonial power actually complicated things and ultimately made the situation worse for the Jewish population living under their rule. Algeria is a good example. Algerian Jewry is probably the clearest example that debunks the whole synchronous expulsion from the Arab world narrative. What happened to them had more to do with how deeply tied they were to the French colonial system and the special treatment they got. The turning point was the Crémieux Decree of 1870, which gave French citizenship to the Jews native to Algeria, but not their Muslim, Arab, or Berber neighbors, who were kept as second-class indigenous subjects under the brutal Code de l'Indigenat. This decree completely changed the trajectory of Algerian Jews. It legally separated them from the rest of the population and tied them to France instead. They quickly adopted French language and culture, which only widened the gap between them and their Arab neighbors. Over time, this made them increasingly alienated from the growing Algerian nationalist movement, which saw them as aligned with the colonial oppressors. This, predictably, sparked some hostilities. When the Algerian War of Independence ended in 1962 and French colonial rule collapsed, nearly the entire Jewish population, about 130,000 out of 140,000, left for France, alongside over 800,000 European settlers, the Pieds Noirs. They weren't expelled by Arabs. They chose to leave because their legal status, identity, and future had been tied to France for nearly a century. They also feared that their non-Jewish neighbors would resent them for their close relations with the French oppressors, all thanks to French colonial policy. It is true that some Algerian...
they were given the opportunity to become Algerian citizens, and they chose to be French citizens instead. They chose to go with the rest of the French nationals that escaped in the aftermath of Algerian independence.
Jews found themselves in horrible living conditions, but the vast majority were perfectly fine, as Tom Segev recounts in his book.
It's wild that Americans don't know about the Algerian Revolution. I mean, is it that wild? I mean, it was so important to another anti-apartheid, anti-colonial movement, South Africa. That's why Nelson Mandela was sent to jail. He went there. He trained with the Algerian revolutionaries. And then when he came back to South Africa, they were like, "Oh, jail time for you. You're done."
book, The First Israelis. Only 30% of the Jews of Tunisia and Algeria had to be saved. The remaining 70% were in no danger. He then points out how the situation in Morocco was comparatively worse ever since 1948, but there were still Jews living normal lives and doing all right, further illustrating that Jews in the MENA region during that time period ought not to be viewed as a monolith. If we take a closer look at Morocco and examine the reasons for Jewish emigration, things took a turn for the worse after the creation of Israel in 1948. There were riots and rising hostility, not just in Morocco, but throughout many parts of the MENA region due to the Zionists' crimes against the Palestinians and the subsequent refugee crisis that took place. Still, the Moroccan government had rules in place to prevent the immigration of Jews, specifically from 1956 to 1961. Now, this wasn't out of some love for Jews or a desire to keep them around. It was mostly about economic concerns. The key to understanding why Moroccan Jews left is Operation Yaqin from 1961 to 1964. This wasn't some sudden expulsion, it was a clandestine, organized migration deal between Israel's Mossad and King Hassan II of Morocco. Israel basically paid Morocco to let Jews leave. $500,000 up front and then $100 per person for the first 50,000 people, and $250 for each person after that. So yeah, it was basically a paid population transfer. Over 3 years, close to 100,000 Moroccan Jews emigrated. Most ended up in Israel while some went to France or Canada. A lot of Moroccan Jews left by choice. Some were Zionists. Others just wanted better opportunities, but there was also immense pressure coming from the Zionist movement. Tom Segev points out that Zionist agents on the ground weren't always gentle, and in some cases, Jews, especially from rural areas in Morocco, were virtually taken aboard the ships by force. Israel needed Jews to emigrate because they needed what they referred to as human material to secure a demographic majority, exploit for labor, and fight in their wars. Even though they considered Mizrahi Jews to be bad human material, they were useful insofar as they could replace Arab labor, which the Zionists wanted none of. So when we look at what happened in Morocco, it wasn't a clear-cut expulsion or heroic rescue by the Zionists. It was kind of a backroom deal. Morocco wanted money, Israel wanted immigrants, and Moroccan Jews ended up caught in the middle. When analyzing this period in history, we can see Arab countries not only fail to act in unison in some mass expulsion, but oftentimes we can see completely different strategies coming from different Arab countries. As Segev noted, some countries encouraged Jewish migration to Israel in the hopes it would overwhelm the Israeli economy, and other countries prevented migration to Israel so that Jewish manpower couldn't be used to serve the young settler colony. Some of the Jews emigrated spontaneously, whether as a result of distress or persecution or for Zionist or religious reasons. Others came in response to the Zionist propaganda disseminated by the Zionist emissaries in their countries. Some drifted with the emigrating mass, and some actually found themselves in Israel against their will. I hope this is painting a picture that contradicts the notion of a double Nakba. Bahrain, for instance, wanted to keep their Jewish population because, as Segev wrote, the ruler believed that Islamic commandments ordered Muslims to act as protectors of Jews. The story of how Yemenite Jews migrated to Israel is an interesting yet tragic one too. The Zionist project took advantage of their faith and instilled messianic fervor among the Jews of Yemen. As Segev put it, some of them were desperately poor, subjected to oppression and discrimination, and for them, the passage to Israel was a liberation, but there were others who lived peacefully and at ease. As farmers, goldsmiths, craftsmen of all kinds, and merchants. There too, the Jews had to be encouraged to go to Israel, and there too, the messianic longings had to be organized. The way in which those longings were organized, as Segev notes, was through using local messengers who distributed missives of redemption to the Jewish communities, calling upon them to leave their homes and instructing them how to migrate. Itzhak Raphael, who headed the Jewish agency's immigration department, reported that Arabs had been hired to urge the last Jews of Yemen to depart. He did not say how the urging was done.
It's funny because like this process of consistent migration flows into Israel of Jews has not stopped. because it is a inherently fascist, ethno-religious superiority-induced project, it requires more and more people to go and live in Israel. And the modern version of this is obviously not as sinister, if you will, but it's birthright. It's a free vacation. Oh, are you a Jewish person living anywhere around the planet? Come on, just come. Free vacation. Come to Israel. You'll meet a IDF soldier on your trip and hopefully fall in love. And then you'll try to stay, hopefully stay in Israel. That's it. That's literally it. It sounds insane when you describe it, but like that is the purpose. The purpose of it is to try and get the purpose of this is to try and get people to come to Israel, to see how beautiful it is, to see how wonderful it is, and basically get people to stay in Israel. And some people do. Except I don't know what the birthright system looks like currently, because I feel like for many young American Jews, I feel like they don't f with Israel as much as they used to.
Jewish agency emissary in Aden, Shlomo Schmidt, asked permission to propose to the Yemenite authorities that they expel the remaining Jews from their country. Once they arrived in Israel, the Yemenites received some of the worst treatment and neglect among the Middle Eastern and North African migrants, leading to illness, humiliation, and death. There was even a phenomenon of Yemenite babies going missing and turning up dead, hundreds of them. To this day, the Israeli government has not properly addressed or atoned for this tragedy known as the Yemenite children affair. Mizrahi Jews during this period were expected to leave behind their ways of life, which the Ashkenazi establishment viewed as primitive, and a European culture was forced onto them. Haaretz once published, "The peculiar tragedy with these immigrants," Jews from the MENA region, in contrast to the bad human material from Europe, meaning Holocaust survivors, they referred to them as bad human material too, by the way, is that there is nothing to hope for from their children either. Nothing like the quote-unquote safe haven for Jews calling Mizrahis and Holocaust survivors.
Like there's two different forms of domination because there's also a racial pecking order within Zionism amongst Jews as well. Like it's a double racist. If you're Ethiopian, triple racist is crazy. On the one hand, Israel needs a constant migration of Jews from all around the world to go to Israel and to repopulate Israel with Jewish babies. But then also at the same time, there is like an internal racial pecking order amongst Jews as well. With Jews from Yemen being at the bottom of that totem pole until recently, I would say, like now it's the Ethiopian Jews. Or I guess technically Jews in Uganda who are not even allowed to immigrate into Israel. So technically they're the lowest of the low, so much so that they're like actively do not want them in Israel. But I guess you could say that about Ethiopian Jews as well. But it's crazy. What he's going to describe to you is something that I've talked about a lot here as well. It's what Americans and Canadians did to the indigenous population through like residential schools. Like it's a practice of just basically stealing children and then giving them to good crop families, white Ashkenazi Jewish families that were better integrated into the Western focused Israeli society that was developing.
Bad human material. Let's look quickly at Iraq before we end this segment. I've spoken ad nauseum about the Jewish emigration from Iraq on this channel. This video will go more in depth, but as a quick summary, Jews lived in the land known today as Iraq for millennia. As we've been over, they held positions of status and authority, and for the most part, were respected pillars of the community prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. The Zionist movement changed that, and, quoting Segev, in some places, the Zionist awakening worsened the situation of the Jews. Iraq was one of those places. Segev goes as far as to claim that, at least in the beginning, animosity toward Jews in Iraq was targeted solely at Zionists, not Jews, and the distinction was being made. The Mossad's files abound with telegrams reporting the persecution of Jews in Iraq, but almost all of them refer to Jews who have been involved in the activities of the Zionist underground or who were suspected of belonging to it. There was little harassment of other Jews. But as things progressed in Iraq, the line between Jew and Zionist blurred. Pan-Arab nationalism was growing in Iraq for two main reasons. One, Iraq was under British colonial influence, and many Iraqis despised that. Since the British were the main sponsor of the Zionist project and were responsible for documents like the Balfour Declaration, some Iraqi nationalists perceived the Jews as in cahoots with the Brits, especially since the British, and the French in other instances, gave Jews preferential treatment out of the belief that they would be less susceptible to nationalist movements that would threaten colonial power. Second, the settler colonial project in Palestine, which had been underway since the 1800s, increased animosity toward Jews in the MENA region, who were perceived by some to be somehow responsible for the atrocities committed by the Zionist settlers and militias. Now, this was obviously incredibly unfair for many reasons, one of which was that many Mizrahi Jews, specifically in Iraq, wanted nothing to do with Zionism. As Avi Shlaim recounts a conversation he had with his 91-year-old mother in which he asked her about Zionism, she replied with, "Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It had nothing to do with us." In 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law called the Denaturalization Law, in which Jews could register to leave the country and go to Israel. However, not many Jews signed up for this. For the most part, they didn't want to leave Iraq. But remember, the state of Israel needed that precious human material. So what did the Zionists do? Well, they bombed Jewish targets in Iraq to speed up the emigration process and scare the Jews into registering to leave the country for Israel. This campaign was fairly effective. As Shlaim wrote, there was a direct correlation between the bombings and the rise in the number of applicants to emigrate from Iraq. This bombing campaign was carried out by the Zionist underground and blamed on Muslims. There were many bombs that went off in Iraq during this period, and most of them were done by Zionists, according to Avi Shlaim, who, in his book 3 Worlds, provides what he calls undeniable proof. However, it's important to understand that this bombing campaign was not the only reason for Jewish emigration to Israel. That's not Shlaim's argument. He concedes that the atmosphere in Iraq was genuinely becoming hostile for Jewish Iraqis due to the Zionist project, and that shouldn't be swept under the rug. Shlaim's point is that the Zionist project acted belligerently and dangerously with the goal of turning Jewish people across the region into pariahs or making them feel unsafe so they would move to Israel. A similar false flag bombing campaign, albeit a failed one, took place in 1954 Egypt, where a number of Egyptian Jews were arrested for planting bombs in public spaces and in the U.S. Information Service offices in Cairo and Alexandria. This was an Israeli false flag operation designed to create bad blood between the revolutionary regime headed by Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Western powers. Israel's military intelligence had recruited...
Bro, God. Dude, Israel has so consistently engaged in some of the most insane shit, which they still do to this day. Total violation of whatever norms that people think they have. I mean, even the beeper attack, which is an insane act of terrorism, was applauded, was celebrated in Western media like it was so ingenious. When you had Leon Panetta, former CIA head Leon Panetta, being like, what the f are you guys talking about? This is so unimaginably psychotic. There are very well-defined rules in the rule books that we designed so that nobody does this, because you create an environment of uncertainty around like regular commodities that people consume. This is like, if turned into a similar violent act against like Western powers, we'd understand it as terrorism. Is one of those things. Like, there are certain norms that countries abide by, and Israel has routinely violated those norms from its beginning all the way to its end, basically. And one of them is just, you don't assassinate heads of state. Obviously, America sometimes violates that as well, but like Israel doing it is like doubly because Israel is not America, right? It's supposed to be this sovereign nation state.
Recruited, trained, and equipped the Jewish spy and sabotage ring. The Israeli officer in charge, Mayor Max Bennett, the same Max Bennett who had directed the false flag operations in Baghdad a few years earlier. Another sick aspect of the double Nakba theory is that it makes Palestinians pay for the wrongdoings of others. If an Arab in Iraq or Yemen or Egypt turns on his Jewish neighbor, why should a Palestinian be punished for that? Arabs, like Jews, are not a monolith. The experience of a French citizen Jew in Algeria choosing to move to France is not the equivalent to that of an Iraqi Jew fleeing Baghdad after a false flag bombing campaign, nor is it the same as a Yemeni Jew being airlifted to Israel amid a wave of messianic fervor stoked by Zionist emissaries. Nor does it resemble the experience of Jews who sought refuge in Lebanon, which was considered a relative safe haven after 1948. And when Lebanese Jews eventually chose to leave due to civil war and economic instability, they primarily moved to the US and Europe, not Israel. In fact, as Dr. Kirsten E. Schultz, author of The Jews of Lebanon, wrote, most Lebanese Jews were in complete agreement with the Arabs that Zionism and its endeavors in the land of Israel were the cause of all troubles. All that said, I'll conclude with this. The Jews from the MENA region emigrated to Israel for a variety of reasons. Some were fleeing poverty and discrimination. Some moved against their will. Many went to Europe, the US, and Canada, and many went to Israel. The ones who found themselves in Israel were unjustly discriminated against, not by Arabs, but by European Jews. Nonetheless, they were still able to expropriate Palestinian land and settle there, while Palestinians got ethnically cleansed. When an absolute moron like this guy tries to tell you that the Nakba was actually more devastating for Jews than Palestinians, he's engaging in a form of Nakba denialism. The original Zionist settlers sought to live in peace.
Holocaust denialism. It's the same. It's fascism through and through. You know, you got to deny historic atrocities, of course, if you want to justify your fascist ideology, your fascist worldview.
With the indigenous population. This narrative typically goes as follows. Jewish people sought refuge in the land of Palestine, not as settlers, but as benign co-inhabitants, yet the barbarous Arab population greeted them with hostility. This is obviously bullshit.
This is the Zionist settlers wanted to coexist in peace argument.
And if you've watched the video up until this point, I would have already refuted this argument along the way. But to reiterate, the original Zionist settlers did not want to simply seek refuge among the Palestinians. They wanted to eliminate and replace them. Well before even the 1920s, Zionist leaders are on record deliberating about how they could get rid of the Palestinians. Ben-Gurion reiterated his ambitions in 1937 when he wrote to his son that the real goal of the Zionist settler movement was not peaceful partition, but the possession of the land as a whole. Zionists looked down on Palestinians from the jump. As Miller Burroughs put it, the attitude of the Zionists toward the Arabs, at its worst, has been that of our Western frontiersmen, who said that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. At its best, the Zionist attitude toward the Arabs has been patronizing and paternalistic. Burroughs points out how the Zionists...
Early leaders were frustrated with how nice some of the Jews were to the indigenous population. It's like, you need more smoke. What are you doing? It's true. Because remember, like, I think it was around 2% of the population was already was Jewish in historic Palestine, even before British mandate, even before British control.
Would only accept the indigenous Palestinians if they would submit to Jewish control of the country. The hand of brotherhood held out to the Arabs has always been that of a rather patronizing elder brother. In addition to the disrespect and belittling on the part of the Zionists, they also subjugated the Arab population economically through instruments such as the Histadrut, their trade union organization. In fact, Palestinian labor and goods were banned from the market. The Zionists believed in a concept of Hebrew labor, which sought to eventually bring an end to Arab labor. This was exclusivist and devastating to the Palestinians, especially paired...
This is part of the reason why Noam Chomsky says that the Israeli apartheid structure is even more violent than the South African one in both its inception and its continuation, because while they don't actually abide by this terminology or abide by this standard, even from the early days, the concept was to eradicate all Palestinians rather than use them as cheap, affordable labor. Of course, they still used Palestinians as cheap labor, hyper-exploited labor in perpetuity, but the South African apartheid structure required the 90% black population to be relegated to servile status. Israel nowadays also uses a lot of international labor, ironically, not dissimilar to the kafala system that you see in some of these Gulf countries, just like cheap imported foreign labor that can be easily discarded. Real crazy stuff overall, really f***ed up overall. But, you know, interesting to consider, especially when you factor in how many socialists or self-described national socialists were a part of the inception of the Israeli nation state.
With the fact that Zionist organizations were buying up Palestinian land from absentee landlords, remnant from the Ottoman times, and evicting Palestinians from where they lived and worked for generations. The signs of a disaster in the making were already evident as newly landless Palestinians evicted from the farms they had made fruitful were forced to move to the towns. These Palestinians were victims of nominally socialist Zionist groups known as Hebrew labor, who believed Jews could only modernize themselves through engagement in productive labor. Hence, they wanted agricultural work to become the preserve of Jews alone, wrote Pape. The way these Zionist settlers treated the Palestinians was so horrible that Miller Burrows argues, and I wholeheartedly agree, that the Palestinians were acting rationally and were well within their right to reject any variant of the Zionist project as soon as its true colors began to show. It may fairly be asked why one should oppose Jewish nationalism and sympathize with the nationalistic aspirations of the Arabs. The answer is that the Jews are one in religion, but citizens of many countries, whereas the Arabs are one in culture, but belong to different religions, and the countries in which they aspire to self-government are their own native lands. The great trouble with Zionism is the attempt to be both a religion and a nation at the same time. The plan for Palestine, advocated by the Arabs, was a democracy with freedom of religion and complete separation of religion and the state, as in the US. Israel now claims to be a democracy with freedom of religion, but insists at the same time on being a Jewish state. The truth of the matter is the Palestinians would have accepted the Jewish settlers and did accept them and work with them before their political claims and activities became clear. The Palestinians at first were warm and hospitable to the Zionists, offering them employment, shelter, and were open to working shoulder to shoulder with them. But the Zionists did not want that kind of cohabitation with the Palestinians. None of this would have happened if the Zionists had not claimed that Palestine belonged to them, and frankly avowed their intention to make it as Jewish as England is English, Burrows writes. He follows this up by saying, whatever might have been possible if the Jewish national home had not expanded with such vigor and speed, any real friendly cooperation was soon out of the question. As Jewish immigration increased and the settlements were able to get along more and more without employing Arab labor, the common people grew more and more afraid that they would, as the report of the Shaw Commission put it, be deprived of their livelihood and pass under the political domination of the Jews. Certainly the Arabs wanted peace. They asked nothing, in fact, but to be left alone. So not only is it untrue that the Zionist settlers sought peaceful cohabitation, it's equally untrue that the indigenous Palestinians greeted them with animosity. Hostilities only arose after the malevolent ambitions of the Zionist project became clear. The Palestinian emancipatory movement is akin to a Nazi movement. You see? You see this picture, guys? That's a...
Remember when my former podcast co-host randomly brought forward a completely irrelevant allegation that I was just like the Palestinian Grand Mufti, a British colonial servant himself, ironically enough, was exactly like me, a dangerous anti-Semite. Incredible.
That's an important Palestinian guy. I'm sure you've heard this talking point many times. It's commonly used by Zionists of all levels of notoriety, Even Israeli prime ministers, from Naftali Bennett, who refused to sympathize with the plight of innocent Palestinians and instead chose to write them off as Nazis in a Sky News interview.
Are you seriously keep on asking me about Palestinian civilians? What's wrong with you? Have you not seen what happened? We're fighting Nazis.
To Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who infamously propagated the lie that it was actually the Palestinian Grand Mufti who gave Hitler the idea to exterminate Jewish people. This is so bigoted against Palestinians that he's looped all the way around to doing Holocaust revisionism. That claim of his, however, stems from the fact that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini,
Israeli Jews care so much about anti-Semitism that they voted for this guy over and over again, by the way, like after he said that. So that's pretty cool.
Was in fact involved with the Nazis. You may have even seen this image before. That's him with, well, you know who the other guy is. So what's the deal with that? I asked my friend Chris Kunzler, who makes incredibly well-sourced and detailed videos on Israel-Palestine, to join us for this segment so we can pick his brain. I asked him to fill us in on how exactly this guy rose to a position of prominence within British Mandate Palestine.
So al-Husseini was a member of one of the key notable families in Palestine at the time, the Husseini family, and this was kind of the key reason for his appointment. His half-brother was previously the Mufti of Jerusalem until he died in 1921, and then very quickly the Mufti took over. The Mufti basically came to his position because of collaboration with the British. According to Tom Segev, the Israeli historian, his brother had helped the British, and they saw the Mufti as a figure who would also be able to do this. In fact, the Mufti was brought by Ronald Storrs, who was the former governor of Palestine, to meet with Herbert Samuel, who was the first High Commissioner of Palestine. And very quickly, the Mufti explained that he was, going to collaborate with the British. He liked them.
What? No way. Huh.
That he thought that, they were able to support the Palestinian cause. And at this time, it wasn't really all that surprising. The elite class within Palestine believed that the British would help them. And so the Mufti was someone who was from a notable family. He was seen as someone that would work well with the British. And even if he opposed the concept of Zionism, he was going to be someone that, would help the British to control and administer Palestine.
But the trajectory of the Mufti's relationship with the British changed dramatically during the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 through 1939, where Palestinians rallied against the British colonial rule and sought the end of British support for Zionism.
So according to Ghassan Kanafani, who's, a key figure within the Palestinian revolutionary movement, he says that during the 1936 Arab revolt in Palestine, that the Mufti was someone who helped to calm things down, that he was expressly thanked actually for the sermons that he was giving because they served to quell more revolutionary tendencies. Also, Kanafani is kind of opposed to him because he sees him as someone who was like, a member of the elite. He wasn't understanding the actual problems that Palestinians had. So during the beginning of the Arab revolt, he was not necessarily the kind of person who the British would have been entirely opposed to. However, this sort of changed. He was always someone who opposed the two-state solution, who opposed Zionism. And so eventually the British kind of saw him as someone that was going to be a problem towards the implementation of the Zionist project. And he and many other leaders fled into exile following the Arab revolt.
See, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, was a guy who was propped up by the British, and as things progressed, he turned on them, and down the line, he teamed up with their main enemy. After fleeing Palestine, he eventually ended up in Nazi Germany, and later became a propagandist. As Ilan Pape wrote, he landed in Nazi Germany in 1941, making radio broadcasts to mobilize Arab Muslims against the British. At the time of the Second World War, he was not alone in acting according to the maxim, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." His flirtation with the Nazis was short and insignificant, making no difference one way or the other to the war effort. However,
especially considering that 11,000 Palestinians actually fought alongside the Allied forces against Nazi Germany.
his association with the Nazis is still used to discredit the Palestinian liberation movement in the Israeli narrative. Unfortunately, the Israeli narrative seems to conveniently leave out the fact that thousands and thousands of Palestinians actually fought the Nazis and... 12,000 Palestinians. Many of them died in the process, but I guess that inconvenient fact doesn't make for good Zionist propaganda. Palestinian-American academic Edward Said has extensively explored the way in which the West constructs images and narratives of those in the Near and Far East to paint them as barbarians and ultimately make permissible any form of violence against them. This is a strategy used by Western powers to further their imperialist ambitions. By conflating the legitimate emancipatory aspirations of the Palestinians with the aspirations of the Nazis, Zionists can justify nearly any amount of cruelty against the Palestinians.
To have an other which is barbarous is obviously great in the sense of like inflicting violence on them, and it justifies the techniques of control that are inhuman in many cases that are used on people, specifically in the context of Palestine. You know, the inhuman control. You'll regularly hear a Zionist who is, you know, full blown be like, well, we need the checkpoints because the Palestinians, they're always doing terror attacks. And it's just a really unbelievable thing to say because it's a complete and utter degradation of like people's normal existence. People wait for 10 hours at those checkpoints. So in one way, it's a justification of techniques of control, but you also have is the justification of extreme violence. You know, if Palestinians are portrayed as savages, we hear about all the savagery of October the 7th. So who cares what they do to a leader of Hamas? It doesn't matter if Israel tears them to pieces with bombs. That's sophisticated. But it also has always acted as like a launching point for European society. This is like a somewhat underappreciated element of Edward Said. What he's talking about is basically how this kind of other that is barbarous continually makes Europeans feel better about themselves. It is a way of basically establishing us as, you know, good, just, and moral. And in the context of Palestine, Nazi is a particularly poignant concept, obviously because the Jewish relationship with the Nazi. Menachem Begin, who was the first Likud prime minister of Israel ever, the first non-Labour, consistently called Yasser Arafat a two-legged beast, a term which he had only previously reserved for Hitler. He referred to Arafat as Hitler, and he said that he would get the same satisfaction from killing Arafat in his bunker in Beirut as he would get from killing Hitler in his bunker, comparing a man, Yasser Arafat, who would regularly condemn the Holocaust, who would say that the atrocities against Jewish people were totally inappropriate and that his problem was with Zionism and that the Palestinians had experienced at its hands, to someone who believed in an extremist form of racist identity politics. What this effectively does is it places Palestinians not as people with reasonable demands, not as human beings who want to have dignity and equitable solution, but rather people who are akin to the Nazis. By framing Palestinians as Nazis, kind of where you get to is this point where they are dehumanized. They are not people engaging in regular politics. They are evil monsters who need to be dealt with the same way that the Nazis were. So the reason that Zionists are so dead set on the Mufti is because this is the most concrete evidence that they have. Joseph Mossad notes an example of this where like fake evidence was produced as far back as the 1940s. The Jewish Agency in 19...
Ironic because there were more firm commitments and collaborations between one of the early Zionist brigades and Nazi Germany. But of course, using that connection to extrapolate that like all Jews are pro-Holocaust would be unimaginably anti-Semitic.
46 actually tried to show documents that the Mufti had been part of the plans to exterminate Jewish people in Europe with the Nazis. These documents were totally fake.
The desperation to equate the Palestinian liberation movement with the Nazis not only harms the Palestinians, who were very clearly the main victims of such a conflation, but it also whitewashes and revises the ambitions of the Nazis. The Palestinians have a legitimate and noble pursuit. The Nazis absolutely did not. And to add to this, by refusing to actually analyze Nazism as the specific political ideology that it is, we risk failing to learn from history, and we miss the signs when a movement like Zionism so transparently mirrors Nazism.
I've mentioned this before. Hitler is inspired by the killing of the Native Americans. He talks about gunning down Redskins and that being a brilliant thing. David Ben-Gurion says we'll go to Palestine and fight wilder Redskins. There's a very clear thread running between all of these things, and losing that is dangerous because you end up where we are today, which is watching a genocide play out live with full unequivocal support because certain human beings are just still judged to be immoral, unjust, and unworthy.
Palestinians left voluntarily in 1948 because Arab leaders told them to. This is one of the sillier talking points on the list. The argument people try to make is that Palestinians weren't actually ethnically cleansed. They were supposedly told to leave by leaders of the Arab armies fighting on their behalf in 1948.
It was the invading Arab armies that told the Palestinians to leave and come back.
Dude, this is literally Ben Shapiro. It's like, this is straight up what Ben Shapiro lies about. What the This is straight up Nakba denial. I mean, he already did it before, but god damn, dude. It is wild that there are some people that are left in that community that still unironically believe that they're progressive, or even funnier than that, believe that they're actually pro-Palestine. That is insane.
When the war was over.
But this ignores the fact that Zionist plans to deliberately ethnically cleanse and replace the Palestinian population are well documented and were already underway before the Nakba. Even supposed voices of consciousness in the Zionist movement, like Burl Katznelson, spoke of transferring the Palestinian population well before 1948. Keep in mind that the term transfer in this context is used euphemistically. As Palestinian historian Noor Mashallah points out, especially by figures like David Ben-Gurion, who used it as a substitute for expulsion. I mean, we could see the guy clear as day writing to his son saying that he's trying to expel the Arabs and take their place. Evil Danny DeVito over here wasn't that great.
Wait. Apparently they're going to start dual streaming on Kick? Who? H3 podcast is going to start dual streaming on Kick? Be for real. Ain't no way. The guy, you mean to tell me that the guy who went on a crusade against Twitch claiming it was the most anti-Semitic platform out there is now going to a platform for the bag? A platform that he actually played a role in the creation of, ironically enough, when he was anti-gambling. He's now going to the gambling platform that is a safe haven for pedophiles and Nazis? How bad is the business, man? How bad is the business going? Here's the clip.
This Mr. Beast stuff.
So Mr. Beast made a huge announcement.
Stuff here.
He's moving to Kick, which I'm going to come out and say, as someone who's a Twitch hater, I hate Twitch, and YouTube I'm consistently just super disillusioned with. They take 30% from my subscribers, from your guys' I think donations too, actually.
Just everything, right?
From everything, yeah. And we get zero support. I can't get a contact with their team. Like they care so little about us somehow, despite us being, one of the biggest live or podcasts on their channel. So I'm against YouTube in this way. I'm against Twitch. We need some meaningful competition.
Yeah, Mr. Beast is like a pretty insane get for them. Like, it doesn't get much more mainstream than that.
Right.
He's YouTube's biggest channel. Like, for them to get the biggest talent on YouTube on their platform is really big for them.
Yeah, it's big. And it's becoming more mainstream. Like, I'm starting to see clips and shows on there that do Kick shows where I'm like, this is like
just normal
content. Good. Yeah, this is like
not people slamming slots for 15 hours.
What the is going on? Bro, what? Is there anything that these dudes believe in? Anything at all? It's literally a platform designed to bring in more people to the online, unaccountable cryptocurrency casino. He did countless hours of shitting on Kick. And that's before we even talk about like the explosive anti-Semitism. How bad is the Teddy Fresh sales that you're doing this? Jesus Christ, dude. God damn how hypocritical this is. Holy I mean, he's already gone along with the first principle of becoming a Kick streamer, which is to do an endless sequence of Hasan content. Might as well get paid for it, I guess.
Or whatever. There's actually normal shows and normal stuff happening there now. And Mr. Beast being on there is a big difference. And I'll tell you guys, I've talked to Kick We were thinking about multi-streaming, not moving, nothing dramatic, just broadcasting to Kick in addition to YouTube. It would change anything for you guys. It's simply a multi-streaming thing. Because I think this competition at this point, it's hard. You can't ignore it anymore because it's coming so big. And now with Mr. Beast there, it's a thing, right? And the competition is important. YouTube and Twitch suck.
At live. YouTube at live.
YouTube sucks at live. Their bot stuff is great. There, yeah.
I feel like after all the drama with Twitch, I always appreciate YouTube.
During the quote-unquote manufactured drama of Twitch being anti-Semitic, Ethan never actually turned the crosshair of criticism to YouTube, which still housed, at the time, millions of different anti-Semitic content creators. And now he's going directly to the heart of anti-Semitism, Kick. That is insane, dude. That's actually insane.
So much.
That's true. I think their live team, honestly, YouTube in general, their operation has always been very good.
Yeah.
I feel personally slighted.
I feel like when it comes to live.
Okay, I don't want to watch the rest of it. That is wild, dude. As an old viewer of Ethan, as a person with a lot of nervous tics, including coughing, he seems like he's going through a lot of stress. I do not share his views at a genocide, of course, but he needs to get out of the internet ASAP. Yeah, once again, all of this could have been avoided if he didn't choose to personally engage in career suicide by hitching his wagon to a apartheid state that he left during a genocide that he chose to actively defend by constantly calling out its critics, anti-Semitic, terrorists, and a number of different, like, incredibly violent right-wing things, while also claiming that he was a stalwart ally of Palestinians. Oh my Lord. If he had just listened to me when I tried to have an earnest conversation with him to be like, dude, don't do this. Here's why you're wrong. Literally early months of October 2023. He wouldn't have to be in this position right now. And I don't think that he's ever going to stop. I checked out of that part of the world. I checked out of that conversation a long time ago. But I suspect that he will just like continue broadcasting to a smaller and smaller audience, regardless of how much, how little revenue it generates. And he'll just keep going crazy. That's wild, man. I don't think he also realizes that, like, a big part of I don't think he realizes that a big part of this, man, I don't even know what to say, honestly. Like a lot of the people that came into his community that like dramatically shifted his community, because every now and then when I go on Reddit, like it shows up on my main page, and the stuff that I see from the subreddit of a community that I was a part of, that I was like literally a host on with the Leftovers podcast, the shit that they say about me on there is mind-boggling. Sometimes I read it and I'm like, is this Steven Crowder's subreddit? Like, what the hell's going on? They'll be like, Hasan is a Islamo-supremacist. He hates Jews. He loves the Armenian genocide. He's a Turkish ultranationalist. It's like, it's shocking. It's lunatic behavior. And I'll see like people defending Destiny in the subreddit being like, no, Hasan actually Hasan received unsolicited news on a Snapchat, and that's somehow the same, if not worse, than what happened to Destiny, who was a real victim of this situation where he was like both non-consensually and consensually recording people that he was having sex with and then unconsensually sharing it with random Discord neo-Nazi e-girls that he wanted to without telling anybody else that he was sharing this revenge porn material. That's actually the same. If not, Hasan is worse, as a matter of fact. Like, that's the type of, that is the type of mental gymnastics you only engage in if you have a deliberate attempt to actively put down an enemy of sex pestiny while simultaneously bring up sex pestiny as a viable alternative, which only leads me to believe that the community is entirely changed. And all of those people are eventually going to leave Ethan's ass behind too. That he has almost he's pushed aside what made his community whole. He pushed aside every single person, every single actual fan, to farm a new audience that doesn't care about him at all. And he doesn't realize that he's a useful idiot, both for defending Israel's genocide after far after the average person who had any sort of loyalty to Israel would ever defend it. He said your dad negotiated with Hamas as well. What the? Oh, Jesus Christ. He's slowly transforming into a locale. I think he already is there. It's a sad state of affairs, man. I don't know. I think the solution to this would be to just like go offline for a little bit and really reconsider your behavior, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. You just gave him 100 days of material to clip chimp you and lied to his audience. I don't think it matters. Has he even... Look, I don't really pay attention to whatever the fuck he's up to, but I assume he has not stopped anyway, right? Like, that's usually how it goes. Like, a lot of people will be like, oh, just ignore it, which I do. But it's the same with it's the same with sex pestiny. It's the same with Epstein. Like, they don't ever go away. Because, like, at a certain point, it becomes this, the only type of content that they can generate any attention around. He's working on his next video on you, trying to portray you as a sex pest and a pedo. If that happens, I hope you respond to that video. You can't let that sick fuck keep defaming you. He knows he can do this shit because you won't sue. And what are you going to do? No, he was saying the other day you're on steroids. Bro's complimenting you, Lamau. He will stop eventually. I don't think he will. I think he's just going to keep doing it. It is slander. Everything he says about me is slander. And if it's not slander, it's just like incredibly racist statements. Anyway, who gives a fuck about what he's saying? Let's move on. Let's get back to the video.
Great at keeping it a secret. I'm going to really quickly read a few passages that refute this talking point. I could spend all day on it, but this video is already going to be insanely long, so I gotta speed things up. Shlomo Ben-Ami, who is not exactly an anti-Zionist in any capacity given that he's worked for the Israeli government, has refuted this narrative himself in his book, Scars of War, Wounds of Peace. It's not at all clear, as maintained by a conventional Israeli myth, that the Palestinian exodus was encouraged by the Arab states and by local leaders. Benny Morris found no evidence to show that either the leaders of the Arab states or the Mufti ordered or directly encouraged the mass exodus. Indeed, Morris found evidence to the effect that the local Arab leadership and militia commanders discouraged flight, and Arab radio stations issued calls to the Palestinians to stay put, and even to return to their homes if they had already left. True, there were more than a few cases where local Arab commanders ordered the evacuation of villages, but these seem to have been tactical decisions taken under very specific military conditions. They did not respond to an overall strategy either of the local Palestinians.
Also, what's really interesting about that is that, okay, let's say Arab commanders told the Palestinians to leave. Why did Israel not let them return? They're civilians. Why has Israel not allowed them to return to this day? Like, what are you even talking about? Yeah, let's say there was a tactical retreat or whatever the Arab commanders were like, you have to leave your homes right now. And everyone was like, okay, I'm leaving my home. Okay, why can't they return then? What do you mean? People don't understand. Even throughout like medieval times, like wars are waged. And then, but the civilians are supposed to be, I mean, not always, but civilians are supposed to be allowed to continue existing in the place that they were with just new rulership, new ownership. What are we talking about? Unless they take people as slaves, which has happened quite a bit as well. Yeah, you can't collect taxes from the peasantry or even rebuild a new standing militia from the peasantry if you kill all the peasantry or you expel them.
Palestinian leaders or of the Arab states.
It was the invading Arab armies that told the Palestinians to leave.
As Ilan Pappé explained, this myth, originally invented by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, was a way to dodge responsibility for the Palestinian right of return. At the time, the U.S. government, especially under John F. Kennedy, was pressuring Israel to address the refugee crisis caused by its ethnic cleansing campaigns. To deflect blame, Israel hired researchers and scholars to fabricate evidence suggesting that it was Arab leaders, not Israeli terror organizations, who forced Palestinians to flee. One such scholar was Moshe Moaz, whose work Ben-Gurion cited as proof beyond doubt that Palestinians left because the Arab leaders instructed them to. But even Moaz later admitted that his research wasn't about historical accuracy. He was just fulfilling a political assignment. In his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, Pappé further refutes this nonsense by writing, using primarily Israeli military archives, the new Israeli historians were able to confirm many cases of massive expulsions from villages and towns and revealed that the Jewish forces had committed a considerable number of atrocities, including massacres. The Israeli foundational myth about a voluntary Palestinian flight the moment the war started in response to a call by Arab leaders to make way for invading armies holds no water. It is a sheer fabrication that there were Jewish attempts, as Israeli textbooks still insist today, to persuade Palestinians to stay. As we have seen, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had already been expelled by force before the war began, and tens of thousands more would be expelled in the first week of the war. See, in truth, Palestinians were victims of Israeli paramilitary.
I can't stress this enough. Why would they not be allowed to return? Why would the civilians not be allowed to return? Even if it was the Arab militaries that were like, oh, you have to leave now. Civilians are not a part of the warring faction. That's not how this works. Hello. I know this is very difficult for someone who's a defender of Israel to understand. Civilians, different than standing armies, different than any sort of like militant resistance. Civilians are civilians. Now, of course, I can think of one reason why you wouldn't want civilians to return. It's because you have demographic concerns. And the only reason why you would have demographic concerns is if you're a Nazi, which is what Zionism is.
Organizations who carried out a premeditated ethnic cleansing campaign known as Plan Dalit, which entailed large-scale intimidation, laying siege to and bombarding villages and population centers, setting fire to homes, properties, and goods, expulsion, demolition, and finally, planting mines among the rubble to prevent any of the expelled inhabitants from returning. In David Ben-Gurion's own words, the prime objective of Plan Dalit was the cleansing of Palestine. Israel exists to keep Jews of all kinds safe. Okay, really quick, let's recap why Israel does not keep Jews safe and is most definitely not a place for Jews of all kinds. There were the false flag bombing campaigns in Iraq and Egypt that we spoke about earlier. Those not only put Jews directly in harm's way by literally bombing them, but were also carried out with the intention of increasing hostility toward Jews in Muslim-majority countries so they'd feel pressured to move to Israel, which many of them did not want to do. Avi Shlaim remarks on the irony of this in his interview with Novara Media, pointing out how Israel simultaneously claims to aspire to Jewish safety, yet was endangering Jews across the region.
Even if I knew for certain that not a single Iraqi Jew left Iraq to go to Israel because of the bombs, I would still think this is a real indictment of the state of Israel, because Israel was created to provide a safe haven for Jews, not to be harassing and threatening Jews in other countries.
Shlaim goes as far as to claim that Jews today are much less safe in Israel than they are elsewhere, and on top of that, Israel generates anti-Semitism, which harms all Jewish people, wherever they may be.
There is no question that Jews in Israel today are less safe than anywhere else in the world. But it's much, much worse than that. It's much worse than that because Israel generates anti-Semitism. Israel is responsible for the upsurge of hostility towards Jews everywhere.
It's common to hear people claim that Israel is the only place where Jews can be safe, but this is entirely untrue. My response to that claim would be, so safe that they need billions of US dollars for security reasons every year, mandatory conscription, bomb shelters, an Iron Dome, and more just to fight the people they perpetually oppress when those people inevitably retaliate? You think a Jewish dude in Brooklyn is in more danger than a Jewish dude in Israel? Give me a break. And to be clear, it's unsafe not because of some barbarous sea of Arabs, but because Israel is an aggressor and oppressor in the region, and colonialism breeds violent resistance. Also, let's not forget about the aforementioned mistreatment of Mizrahi Jews, the transit camps, the Yemenite children affair, the exploited labor, the constant rhetoric about Jews from the MENA region being primitive and backward. Right from the jump, Israel was a project meant to serve white European Jews primarily. This accusation is corroborated by the way the Zionist project treated Jews from Ethiopia and Uganda. Ethiopian Jewish women were injected with contraceptives, some without their consent, others under coercion, with immigration to Israel and further healthcare made conditional on their compliance. The story of Ugandan Jewry is particularly interesting and upsetting. The Abba Yudaya, a community of black Ugandan Jews whose adherence to Judaism dates back over a century, have been the victims of frivolous obstacles and roadblocks when it comes to their attempts at migrating to Israel. Israel's
pre-watched again
that it doesn't even recognize the Abba Yudaya to be Jews at all.
Why?
This is quite strange given their 100 years of adherence to the Jewish faith. In stark contrast to the bureaucratic hurdles and, let's be frank, racism the Ugandan Jews faced, South African converts were able to move to Israel relatively smooth.
Wait, one more. Russians. There's one other group. South African converts were easily able to come to Israel in the aftermath of the dissolution of the apartheid in South Africa. Very strange, by the way. My favorite, the people who were like, well, this apartheid is done. Let's go to the next one. Like dudes who are just consistent, you know? They're like, we have to. Yeah, I'm running away from the end of one apartheid and bouldering in the direction of another. So, I mean, that's great. That's got to be awesome for the people who are that invested. Also, there's one other group of people that were able to come to Israel without having any sort of matrilineal tracing of Jewish ancestry, and that was Russians. Now, you might be wondering why. Well, it goes back to the same argument, which is Russians are white. That is what it is, baby.
Smoothly. See, when the South African apartheid ended, some white South Africans didn't want to live in a democratic society, so they made the decision to move to another apartheid regime, Israel. They converted to Judaism and successfully made the move with little pushback from the Israeli state. This Ugandan creator, who is apparently
not just Russians, white people from across the Soviet Union. Yeah, that's true. From all across the Soviet Union. It's so funny. They don't give a bro. White is right.
The many children of the late Ugandan dictator Idi Amin, made a quick video talking about the subject, and I'll link it below. The Balfour Declaration settles it. This is a bit more of a niche talking point, but some Zionists will invoke the authority of the British, specifically the Balfour Declaration of 1917, as though that grants the Zionist movement any actual form of legitimacy. The truth is, the British were making all sorts of contradictory promises back in the day. The Mahmoud Hussein correspondence of 1915 to 1916 saw the British promise to recognize Arab governance in the region post-World War I in exchange for the Sharif of Mecca launching a revolt against the Ottomans. This correspondence came before the Balfour Declaration, yet...
There it is, boys. There it is. The Palestinian betrayal. To be fair, this is not reflective of broader Palestinian society's opinions on this. And I think that for the most part, this is before the Balfour Declaration, for the record. Subject to the above modifications, Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of Arabs within the territories included in the limits and boundaries proposed by the Sheriff of Mecca. Great Britain will guarantee the holy place against all external aggression and will recognize the inviolability when the situation admits. Great Britain will give to the Arabs her advice and will assist them to establish what may appear to be the most suitable forms of government. Yeah. British people, British and French colonial occupation came to the MENA region because they recognized that if they were to take advantage of Arab revolts against the Ottoman occupation, it'd be much easier. Palestinians played a role in this as well. Silver Crow is coping, says, Ottoman Turks massacred us and treated us badly. Britain used this to trick us for support. It's just copium. It's all good, you know. Look, I'm not going to hold the little L against you like that, okay? I'm not going to hold it against you. Many Turks do, though. They're weird about that shit.
Launching a revolt against the Ottomans. This corresponds...
I'm just saying. Imagine believing the British, dude. Imagine believing the British.
Came before the Balfour Declaration, yet it's not treated with any actual authoritative weight. Furthermore, if we're in the business of respecting the Balfour Declaration, Nur Mashala reminds us that the Declaration affirms that the rights of non-Jews are to be respected. Why the cherry-picking about which parts of the Balfour Declaration are important? At the end of the day, the Balfour Declaration was written and backed by notorious anti-Semites who wanted Jews out of their country so they could serve instead as...
And the only dude who was against it in the British Congress at the time was Parliament at the time was a Jewish Bundist.
Regional allies in the Middle East.
What's his name, like Montague or something? I'm forgetting. He has like a cool ass name.
This document shouldn't be treated with any real legitimacy. The 1967 Six-Day War was a war of no choice. The myth goes like this. In 1967, the Arab countries on Israel's borders were going to launch a genocidal war to destroy the Jewish state.
What the f was the dude's name, dude? Hold on. Balfour Declaration. Who was it? Yeah, it was Edwin Montague. I was right. Man, y'all are slow today, dude. Y'all are slow as f today. Yeah, one member of the British government stood against the Balfour Declaration, the only Jewish member, Edwin Montague. That's a cool-ass name. Who asked what authority he could have as HM Secretary for India, responsible for dealing with nationalists and Muslims, when HM government proposed to declare his national home was in Palestine. The writer added to the declaration about Jewish rights and status elsewhere owed something to this opposition, but not his alone. Yeah. Don't even, Lake McGroove is 100% correct. Don't even act like you're not Quick Draw McGraw when it comes to drama links, okay? Even the mere mention of Ethan Klein goes, everybody is like dialed in, ready to go. I got 7,000 links in a matter of seconds. But you can't get the one Jewish guy who opposed the Balfour Declaration. Shame.
And Israel had no choice but to launch a preemptive surprise attack and take them all out.
So in 1967, the Arabs mobilized for all-out war. This is going to be the big war where they finally get rid of this nascent Jewish state that is less than 20 years old. And Israel instead launches a preemptive war.
Now, the reality goes like this.
I love that, by the way. Preemptive war is so funny. Has Israel ever done a first strike that was unwarranted? Because they've never admitted to it, okay? It's always just a sequence of incredible coincidences where, like, Israel blows up everybody in the neighboring region, and then they say, oh, we did it because they were going to blow us up already. You know, preemptive genocide is what's going on in Gaza right now, because there could be a hypothetical genocide of all Jews living in Israel in the future somehow. No, that's not Shapiro making up concepts. That is literally the established narrative. That is the established narrative. That's in history books, big dog. That's not like Benny Boy didn't come up with that on his own, I promise.
In a period of rising tensions between Israel and its neighbors, largely exacerbated by border incidents, Israel's invasion of Egypt in 1956, deadly Israeli attacks in the then Jordanian-controlled West Bank, Israel's diversion of the Jordan River's water into its national...
Yeah, Russia preemptively invaded Ukraine in a preemptive first strike because Ukraine, any moment, the Ukrainian forces were going to roll their tanks into Moscow. Yeah. Yeah, America preemptively invaded Iraq because Iraq was, any moment, Saddam was going to do a Ba'athist 9/11. Yeah. This time, Ba'athist style 9/11 was imminent.
Water carrier leading to tensions with Syria and overall animosity. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser concentrated Egyptian troops in the Sinai Peninsula and closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping. This was his brinksmanship attempt, derived from a legitimate place of fear, to intimidate the Israelis into behaving. Despite Nasser's support for the Palestinian cause, it should be noted that there was a time where he was willing to engage in civil negotiations with Israel. As Pape put it, in the 50s, Nasser was willing to explore the possibility of a deal with Israel which would allow Egypt to have a land bridge with Jordan, as well as the return of the Palestinian refugees from 1948 and the creation of a Palestinian state. Israel was, per usual, uninterested in such a peace. On June 5th of 1967, Israel launched a surprise attack on its neighbors where it took out over 90% of Egypt's air force and enacted similar devastation to Syria's. Since Israel immediately took out the air capabilities of its enemies, it was able to swiftly defeat them as they had no air cover. Israel then went on to claim that they had no choice, and the subsequent Israeli occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, parts of Syria, and parts of Egypt were noble, given that they won those territories in a just war that they had no option but to start. However, in truth, Israel's actions in 1967 were strategic and not the result of necessary defensive measures. Israel understood that since its enemies boasted larger militaries in terms of sheer numbers, any Israeli win would be conditioned on a preemptive strike. Israel also wanted to finish what it started in 1948 and occupy the West Bank and Gaza, as Israel believed it would be incomplete without the West Bank. In fact, at the time of the Israeli attacks on June 5th, there was a US-led diplomatic attempt to normalize relations between Israel and its neighbors already in the works. But Israel had no intention of...
Very anti-Semitic. Very anti-Semitic attempt.
...providing the necessary time to the peace brokers, wrote Pape. He argues that Israel perceived the moment to be the perfect opportunity to correct history and lay claim to all of historical Palestine. I mean, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin admitted himself that the official Israeli narrative of having no choice was bullshit. He said, "In June 1967, we had a choice. The Egyptian army concentration in the Sinai did not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him." Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005.
Well, that's the other thing. The Israeli right, yes, it's literal terrorist Menachem Begin, who once was, I believe, outflanked by Joe Biden, where Joe Biden told him that they weren't going hard enough. Way back in the day. But also, there's two speeds in Israeli society. The far right will flex openly, okay, and the liberal Zionist contingency will go along with these with this myth making, with these narratives, make it seem as though it was like a preemptive strike because it was like imminent, invasion was imminent, it was going to destroy Israel, blah blah blah, all this shit, and the right will always be open about their intentions.
This is proof that Israel wants peace.
By and large, Israelis don't want to conquer Gaza. In fact, they left Gaza voluntarily in 2005.
No, the Gaza pullout wasn't done out of a desire for peace or for the sake of the Palestinians. Ariel Sharon pulled the settlers and the army out of Gaza for wholly selfish reasons. First, there was no genuine withdrawal from Gaza to begin with. Instead of Israel's presence directly in the Strip, it moved right outside the Strip and besieged it, exercising control over what goes in and out, water, electricity, and more. Israel was, and still is, the occupying authority. Second, Sharon pulled the settlers out of Gaza so that he could prove on the world stage that such a messy situation was not worth trying in the West Bank. He also wanted to be able to attack and bomb Gaza from the outside without the risk of hitting an Israeli settler. Controlling Gaza from the outside made the most sense for Israel, So that's why they did it. This quote-unquote disengagement from Gaza also allowed Israel to tighten its grip and redirect its focus toward entrenching the occupation in the West Bank. According to Israeli anti-Zionist Tikva Honig Parnas, those who occupied high levels in Ariel Sharon's government were, frankly, admitting that disengagement from Gaza was a U.S.-Israeli scheme that sought the world's approval for continuing other parts of the unilateral project. In fact, despite the early enthusiasm of Israeli politicians, many of them from the Labor Party, when it came to building...
Yeah, in 1982, Biden told Begin, even more women and children if necessary to get it done. Real freak. Biden has been probably one of the most rabid ultra-Zionists in perpetuity, like in American history. And it's so funny because he's Catholic. Like, he doesn't even have the theological justifications for it at all. He's just been the guy who loves it. A guy who understood, I guess, like Israel's importance and really, really believed in Israel's importance, which is what he famously said with the words, "If Israel did not exist there, we would build it." Like, really understood the importance of Israel as a colonial spearhead. Yeah, he said if Israel didn't exist there as a Jewish nation state, we would invent it.
If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
You think Biden's favorite country would have been Turkey with all the hair transplants he's gotten? Damn. This is why I say he's like such a disgusting monster, dude. What a animal he was. Well, is. He's not dead yet.
Settlements in Gaza, by the 21st century, the consensus had shifted to leave Gaza for the sake of keeping the West Bank. In the words of Ariel Sharon's own senior advisor, the significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. Palestinians squandered every opportunity for peace. So I actually have a whole 35-minute video on this topic, so just go watch it. It's very detailed and covers all the main supposed peace negotiations between the Zionists and the Palestinians, and highlights how the Zionists are the ones uninterested in peace. And more importantly, uninterested in justice. I'll leave it at that for this video. If there's anything I missed, leave a comment and maybe I'll make a quick standalone video covering it the way I did with this one.
Great video from Overzealots. One of the best and brightest of the new crop of Hasanabi heads making big moves. Okay? Incredible video. Definitely go and watch it. Watch it slower for extra engagement. Comment on it. Hasan Reactions is one of the best ones in the React channel.